I'm recording.
You're recording? Okay, cool. All right, well, so yeah, basically I started coming around 6 months ago. And I think one of the first presentations I saw was the Badiou and Marx one. And after that, I started reading Karatani and reading it with a lot of the ideas in that presentation in mind. And for the last 6 months, I've been going over a lot of old issues I've been kind of trying to tie together and just finding the methods that are in, Badiou and Marx and the primer and the overall approach and kind of like trying to link up. Like all these things have been really working to answer a set of questions that basically like come down to TB, like the idea of the state and the usefulness of that distinction within Karatani and then how those kind of link up. And one of the interests I told Gabrielle when I first started coming, I wanted to talk about was logistics and like the historic process of computers and how like the interaction between environments and computers has this kind of feedback mechanism and the actual kind of tracking of that, not so much in terms of like a lot of histories of computers I've read have been about like, the tools and the technologies and stuff, but specifically the history in terms of questions of logistics, like sets of logistical problems that have been posed, governments to companies to whatever, to organizations, and that have been solved increasingly with the power of computers. You can take the thesis, and if you just take computer in the sense it used to mean like people that compute and logistics, you can run it back a long time. But I've specifically been kind of asking these questions in terms of the classic ideas around imperialism and questions around geopolitics and again the state. So here we go. So the first thing, sent out a couple of videos on the Curry-Howard isomorphism, and I'm sure y'all thought that brings up Lenin, so I wanted to go there.
It obviously connects to Lenin.
It obviously connects. So I really like this text, and at a period of my life when I spent a lot of time really trying to think through problems in terms of Lenin and the Bolsheviks, I really resonated with this particular text, A Letter to a Comrade on Our Organizational Tasks, which Lenin wrote around the same year as What Is to Be Done. And actually after the split with the Mensheviks, in one step forward, two steps back, Lenin identifies this text as his more general articulation of his organizational principles, that what is to be done was responding to a specific set of problems in Russia, but in this text he was actually attempting to lay out a distinction or a set of distinctions that were more around organizations generally. And this particular section to me really sums up like the usefulness. Let's see, I gotta hide all the thumbnails for a second. So there we go. This brings us to a highly important principle of all party organization, all party activity. While the greatest possible centralization is necessary with regard to the ideological and practical leadership of the movement, the greatest possible decentralization is necessary with regard to keeping the party center informed about the movement and with regard to responsibility. He then goes down in this third paragraph. The party center should always have before it not only exact information regarding the activities of each of these groups, but also the fullest possible information regarding their composition. He goes on elsewhere to talk a lot about the role in centralization and decentralization, specifically with relation to information. And I actually am realizing I forgot to pull this quote out, but he says a quote elsewhere in this same text, that if you had a sufficient movement of information between centralized leadership and all the different parts of an organization, you would actually need very few rules within any given party. And so as opposed to the kind of picture that you get from What Is to Be Done of this very kind of like disciplined, hierarchical, following these very specific tactics around fighting political police and very specific procedures, he really draws a separate picture here that is less about any given set of rules, any given set of tactics, and more about what is the overall structure that's necessary to correlate parts of an organization in terms of spreading information from a heterogeneous set of parts that are connected to the ground and a homogeneous center that is taking all this information and putting it together. The other place that I found interesting in Lenin, again, in a text that is often pointed to justify a lot of the authoritarian post-revolution Bolshevik stuff, is here. A witty German social democrat of the 70s of the last century called the Postal Service an example of the socialist economic system. This is very true. The present, the Postal Service is a business organized on the lines of state capitalist monopoly. He goes on that basically you can take control of this system with a lot easier compared to, say, police organizations or the bureaucracies, that there's something about the structure of the Postal Service, because its very logistical task requires it to be transparent with its records, to be relatively equitable in making sure that it services the population, and in being efficient. That there's something about the logistical parameters that a postal service needs to meet that make it closer to nationalization or being integrated.
It's funny because it's one of the few things that Lenin agreed with Kropotkin and other anarchist thinkers who also admired the postal service. Like, it was kind of the idealized example of how things could work, you know, for anarchists and communists alike.
Exactly, and it represented something, but it also, I would argue, just at a technological point had a limit, right? And that limit had to do with the capacity for a single kind of infrastructure to homogeneously solve logistical problems for the population. And what you have with the internet is something that actually meets both of these two conditions within Lenin, because it's not just, you know, the 7-layer architecture or the actual computational pieces. The things that are really interesting to me in the internet are things like this first line, the various regulatory bodies that are not representative in the sense that they represent, you know, in a Soviet sense, right? They're not representative in the sense that they represent populations, workplaces, communities, neighborhoods. They represent technical specialties on the basis of logistical problems. And I'll get into later the reasoning that I think is interesting that comes out of this. But they represent something that, despite, and I kind of like, I kind of have some parallel arguments here with what Karatani talks about the UN. There's some interesting things that come out of the need for global capital to reach a compromise on regulation, despite all the fierceness and stupidity of competition, that generates these bodies that produce regulations that, again, kind of like the Postal Service, gives us something that's much closer to the capacity to be kind of appropriated than, say, frankly, most of the things further down this list. Social media, like the things that are properly, quote, big business, big corporation, those things I think I'm much more cynical about just, quote, taking over or whatever in the nationalization sense. But in the big picture, when you're looking at what is the actual logistical thing of the internet, it's not simply the machines and the computers, the servers and networks. It's not even these standards bodies. It's also the social media, the logistics, and the telecommunications, at the very least. I mean, you could make longer lists, but I feel like in order to understand the scope of what something like a non-authoritarian, non-militarized worker state, and I'll get into, like, because basically let's see if I jump to it right now. No, not quite. Well, just to anticipate a bit, like, one of the disagreements I have with Karatani is in his T superscript D, so the last kind of possible exchange form, that he focuses on the sublation of gift economies in terms of kind of being built upon both the actual infrastructure of world economy and the kind of conceptualization of abstract individuality that comes out of commodity exchange. But he also basically says that there's going to be needs to be a complete negation of everything that happens at the level of TB. And what I'm arguing is that this kind of, like, what Lenin was arguing and what I'm trying to rehash here is that we can think of the worker state on something other than an updated despotic state, an updated hierarchical state, and think of the worker state as a logistical system, but one that doesn't follow the same decision-making processes as associations or cooperatives, and doesn't, strictly speaking, fall under a generalization or a sublation of TA or TC. It follows the administrative bureaucratic logic that is posed to states, but not within the confines of like state domination, right? Like there's something that I'm going to argue comes out of the reasoning of states that we can generalize, formalize, and use around logistical issues that needs to happen in order to actually accomplish the kind of sublation that Karatani talks about. Does that make sense? As far as an argument?
Yeah, no, I'm following.
Okay. Cool.
Yeah.
Cool. So, just I don't know, this is more of a thought experiment than anything else, but I think it's a good way to kind of convey the idea I've been trying to flesh out. You know, the general idea from Hegel is this idea of a philosophic encyclopedia, where the organization of the knowledge is somehow kind of isomorphic to the knowledge itself. But that's just the idea. The real thing that I find interesting is the difference of indexing and what happens with indexing between a classical encyclopedia and Wikipedia. Because in a classical encyclopedia, you had a divergence between the indexing as a contiguous storage apparatus. In other words, the way that you actually store and arrange the data to be found by a person, and the cross-indexing of topics. Like at the end of an article, when you see, oh, okay, if you're interested in anthropology, look up this, that, and the other thing, right? Mm-hmm. Former was arbitrary. It was useful, but it's arbitrary in the same sense like the base 10 system is arbitrary, useful, but nothing inherent about it. And there was a fundamental, like, you know, I guess space-time gap between like actually looking things up, moving between. When you move to something like Wikipedia, you have two things happen. You have a collapse of the relationship of the knowledge and the fundamental indexing apparatus, at the same time that you also have a collapse of the space-time gap, you know, functionally instantaneous. So that the way that indexing works in something like Wikipedia is based upon the contents of the knowledge itself, right? You know, so even if you don't ever go down to the external links or to the sources, you can move throughout Wikipedia on the basis of the links in a way that actually follows the logic of the contents. And if you were to create a graph of Wikipedia where the nodes were the articles and the edges were the links, you could actually extract, or at least on principle, extract information about how those knowledge systems are produced. And if you also included information about users, you could come up with you could ask questions about the sociology of knowledge production and whatnot. But there's a level of like informativeness that comes out of this kind of collapsing of indexing onto its own formalizing on its own content. It can be linked to its own content.
Yeah, I'm not sure I followed that part. Like, what's like the difference seems to be in the way that the linkage, the indexing of links is established, right?
Mm-hmm.
But well, I'm not sure I understand why. I mean, what is the difference between having links at the bottom?
Oh, it's not where the links are. Sorry, it's not about
of like general.
I'm trying to say, as opposed to linking out of Wikipedia to an article, a piece of evidence, you can click on, you know, if you go into an article on abstract algebra, you can then click onto an article about modules. From modules, you can click onto an article about primes. From primes, you can click on an article about number theory, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you are traversing the knowledge, and the actual knowledge is, I mean, storage is for all practical purposes implementation deals, but that means as far as your interactivity with the knowledge, your capacity to actually move through the knowledge as a space of pieces of information is coordinated by the way that the knowledge actually links up. And that the indexing is indexed on the linking of the knowledge as opposed to this arbitrary contiguous storage methods of alphabets, right? To me, it's a simple way to try to get a difference of what a culture within which books are the major means of conveying information in computers.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, I originally came across this idea trying to come up, I was teaching in an alternative high school, and I was trying to come up with a project to teach students how to actually produce knowledge. And the idea was going to be, they were going to write a Wikipedia article, and they were going to research it, and they were going to do the links, and they were going to participate in it. And I was trying to come up with a theory of the difference. Part of it, I mean, there was stuff about democracy and participation and access and yada, yada, but there was something also particular about how how through the process of interlinking their article with existing articles in Wikipedia, they were actually interacting and producing knowledge and producing the links of knowledge and the relations of knowledge, and that there was something, you know, real about the structure of information that they were interacting with that wasn't just an arbitrary indexing apparatus. It was something real.
Mhm.
Yeah, I don't really have the language yet to be more precise.
No,
than
but
that.
the thing that I was trying to understand a bit better is that you seem to say that where you have this sort of more classic idea of an article, and then you have a sort of external reference. Like if you're interested in this, go read that. Compared to the Wikipedia, where the references are directly connected to other pages which also have references and so on, is that the structure of this referencing system has some information. I mean, you can look at that network of articles and say something about the stuff that is being connected.
Yes, exactly.
And that part is, for me, is a bit of a jump, because can there be two sets of articles that have the same amount of edges, you know, and totally different information is presented? So what sort of information can you actually extract from, like, why is the internal network structure of the Wikipedia different from any random structure online of hyperlinks and so on?
Well, I think, like, I mean, first off, as far as the actual internal structure, I guess that part is conjecture. So I would need to test that. But I think beyond that, the part that originally for the research was interesting is I think you could link how the knowledge is being produced, or how the knowledge is being linked with the actual users that are producing the knowledge. So it wasn't just simply like looking at the knowledge in terms of like its logical structure, is also the actual process of producing knowledge. You can verify,
I see. Yeah.
examine interconnection. And as far as teaching kids about making knowledge, by the way that they would have to go through Wikipedia to interconnect their own articles in a way that would then bring people to their articles, would actually be in a way like the actual process of interacting that article was a component of the production of knowledge.
Yeah, I see. Yeah.
An ancillary thing. But that shift is important, even if, like, in terms of Wikipedia, it's a small thing. That there's something bigger once you scale up to things like logistics and whatnot, where and that's where I think the videos of this guy, and I don't want to get, by the way, into like I know for programmers there's like paradigm wars and shit. That's not the question, but the thing I found interesting about the Curry Howard videos was this idea that a certain approach to programming had an isomorphic structure with logic, such that you could use proofing to actually study better and worse programming approaches. You could use proofing to study the structure of complex functions that were like attempting to solve a concrete problem. That you could shift between these, at least in principle, and kind of evaluate. You could turn a problem of functionality and problem solving into a problem of proofing and evaluate from that perspective, which is
just a side comment on the Wikipedia thing. Yeah, there's this game called Wikigame. I don't know if you guys played. It's really nice. Like it's an online game where you're given like 2 words. So it's a word that you start on, an article you start, and an article you have to arrive. Really, really random, like Wikipedia article, and then you have to traverse from one to the other in the shortest, with the shorter numbers of steps. And when you play that, you get a feeling of like this kind of stratification between concrete and really abstract articles. So, for example, if you hit the first hyperlink of every article, you most of the times end up in philosophy, like as an article, like basically any article in Wikipedia. So you have this kind of stratification of articles that are abstract and connect to many, and are like in the rich club of the Wikipedia graph, and articles that are like more concrete and more specialized, that you actually have to kind of get out to actually get into another like subject. So yeah, that's just something that I remember about the graph structure about Wikipedia.
I'm playing the game. It's amazing.
What are the two articles you received?
I'm going from engineer to Smithsonian Institution. I first had to go from East to West Africa.
Yeah, normally going by country, it's efficient. Going to the US, it's always like.
Yeah, that's amazing. I'm gonna play this one.
Yeah, it's a really cool idea. I was also going to comment on those lines. Yeah, I mean, this is a random walk process, right? You can, starting from any point in a graph, if you just randomly select an edge and traverse it, and then you keep doing this for a while, you can actually rank all the nodes by their likelihood of ending up there, right? And then that's actually the basis for at least the first version of Google's search ranking system, right? Which is they basically came up with the algorithm to figure out if you were to randomly start on any website on the internet, what is the probability you would end up on any other website? And then the sites which you have a higher probability of ending up on are ranked higher in search. So, and there's probably some like neuroscientific correlate to this. I don't know, like just thinking about like free association, and although, you know, psychoanalysis would have something to say about like the likelihood is not simply, you know, number of connections necessarily.
I just want to skip ahead a bit because I think this might help clarify stuff. This is what these are very particular things I found useful about the methods, and particular ways that I found it's either like helping me overcome previous issues, or clarified why I was running to a dead end with my approaches over basically like about a 5-year period, roughly from the time, more or less, around the time I met you at EGS, Gabrielle, in 2013 to the end of my time in a particular Marxist group in 2018. And that was trying to solve questions of like modern imperialism and geopolitics, and, you know, being an American within the United States and relating to what it means to like try to organize an anti-war movement. So, and all trying to fit it in within like what Lenin and Bukharin said 100 years ago, with mild modifications by some Trotskyists or whatever over the last century. So the three things I continually came up against are precisely the things that Karatani elegantly like points out, but, you know, and gives the tools, and that the formalization that the two of you provide really kind of like helps to actually move from Karatani's level of like very interesting and thought-provoking to actually methodologizing the ideas. So the first one is the idea of imperialism, and especially the quote epoch of imperialism as a stage, and that some kind of utter divide in the 1870s to 90s happened that differentiates capitalism before and after. And Karatani talks about the kind of like cyclical movement between liberalism and imperialism, combined with the progressive development of the economy that shifts in particular around kind of like key commodities and whatnot. And the method that Dennis lays out in from cognitive mappings to sheaves of extension gluing, I think is really like a much better way to see the way that the world economy grew, and especially the way that war functioned as both a component of the economy and as a very particular way that like overall social crises were resolved. And in particular, so much of the perception of what the revolution would look like for the Bolsheviks hinged on this idea that the revolutions they were seeing around them had a very particular relationship to their epoch. But if you go back and you look at the spread of capitalism and the crises that generated the 30 Years' War and the 7 Years' War, those are also the crises that led to the English Civil War and the revolutions there under Cromwell and the levelers and the diggers, and the 7 Years' War and everything that led to the American War of Independence and the French Revolution. And so many of the particular details and the particular things that the Second International in general, and Lenin and Bukharin in particular, try to pull out, and I'll go into some of them in a second, really like you see happening over and over again throughout this period. But they obviously are pointing, and one of the main things that does shift is like the export of capital and whatnot. There are things that shift, and the extension gluing, I think, actually accounts for how you can have repetitions that nonetheless are increasing in intensity and complexity, and not this simple kind of like monolithic stage 1, stage 2. The next thing is that it's what, you know, this is not a particularly elegant phrasing, but it's what I came up with, homoreductive to TC. That in other words, all the analysis comes back to capitalism. Everything has to, in the final analysis, be determined by capitalism, so that the analysis of the state and the analysis of the nation, I think, for example, Trotsky's analysis of fascism as hyper-imperialism or ultra-imperialism is an extension of this kind of thinking, that ultimately saw the kind of like bureaucratic, military, logistical function of the state and the ideological, communal kind of like organizing, unifying capacity of the nation as reductive to capitalism. And like Karatani points out, those are precisely the places in so many different ways that the socialist movements like came up against. The dangers of fascism, the dangers of nationalism within the movement, the dangers of appropriating and taking over the state and trying to turn into a worker state that you saw in Russia. And the overall underestimating and failure to take on as an appropriate object of study in and of itself, and continually reducing it to the critique of political economy. You know, and so for all, as much, and when I read Lenin and Bukharin, they made sense of so much that hadn't made sense before. And I think especially at their time, like I'm not trying to take away from the importance there, but I think there are methodological issues that come up that we can, you know, go beyond. And that's still, you know, I also want to say, I guess I meant to say this at the beginning, but I realize I'm saying this now, is like, I haven't been in academia that much. A lot of my context of debates are from my experience either in activist circles, in very specific theorists like Badiou and Zizek and whatnot that I've stuck to, and then to like normie liberal Americans that I talk to and try to understand why they support the things they do. And so, like, I mean, I just came from a place, like my home in Montana is a place with a lot of dangerous, like right-wing militia folks. So I organize with liberals against right-wing extremists, but then they turn around and they talk about how much they love the intelligence community. And so I get very confused about what's going on. And so like I've been trying, like, so over here on the right, like ideology, Zizek, that's why that's always been so compelling to me. But I think in terms of a lot of the questions I was asking in particular, like not big questions about the theory of ideology, but questions of nationalism, gender, like community. Karatani's chapter on nationalism in The Structure of World History really gives a way to think about the particular, you know, like again, I don't want to make big claims about the theory of ideology in general, but a particular way that ideology maps on to questions of the state and political economy. And in the same way, one of my first academic backgrounds was in kind of like left-wing, I didn't know what it was called at the time, but it was essentially like left-wing critical geopolitics. And I studied the war in Chechnya, as well as the United States stuff and the war on terror. But I continued, especially after Lenin and Bukharin, to try to like, you know, reduce that to questions of capitalism and whatnot. And a lot of the dead ends I ran into, I think Karatani clarifies in terms of TB. And then finally, and I think this is actually something that can be brought up against Karatani, and where I think like the Badiou and Marx presentation really left me thinking for a long time, and I'm going to get back into this more, is the distinction between exchange functions and lattice formations. And I call them lattice formations, just, I don't know why, I just went with that term and kept going with it. But like the relationship between these exchange functions, which Karatani says have to a certain extent always existed insofar as there's been human intercourse or human exchangeability in general. And these particular configurations that come out of kinship of the state and the kind of like prototypical state Karatani focuses on, the Asiatic despotic state, and then the world economy and its particular relationship to the nation state. Thinking through those relationships and the relationships of those to the actual exercise of exchange functions is something that's been really useful in trying to like start thinking through, again, problems that have come up in terms of geopolitics and ideology. So Lenin's set of definitions. So, you know, to be fair again to Lenin, he says throughout his text, Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, that like you can't address this with just definitions, and he gives countless caveats and qualifiers. So I'm not, again, trying to make some claim that he's being overly simplistic or anything like that, but these are the things that he ends up pulling out at the end of the day, and I think that they're useful in trying to understand what gets highlighted by this kind of like stages perspective, and also what ends up getting lost in the process, and the dangers that come out of that kind of that. And so that, you know, the formula, which everyone is familiar with, imperialism is the monopoly stage of capitalism. That there's the particular set of policies, the particular use of the military, the way that borders become an issue can ultimately be explained in terms of monopoly, in terms of finance capital. He then goes on to make an immediate distinction. That on the one hand, we're talking about the merger of bank capital into monopolist associations that are absorbing industrialists. And on the other hand, we're talking about the division of the world in a colonial policy. So we're talking about two kinds of centralization. We're talking about essentially what Marx talks about in Volume 1 of Capital to a certain extent, concentration and centralization, and the dynamics of that policy, meeting with this other thing, the division of the world and a colonial policy, which, again, to give Lenin full credit, he continually highlights throughout the text, and will go on and be one of his 5 conditions in the next list. However, I think what gets missed, and what a combined reading of Karatani and the methods that are being developed through objective phenomenology gives, is why this second thing matters in terms of the rest. Because Lenin, it's treated as an important fact, right? Like the world has been divided up. There's no place else to go. So that has economic repercussions in terms of capital. In fact, quite a bit of the apocalyptic predictions of socialists at the time, that we were just on the end of just around the corner of the final battle, had to do with the fact that the world had been divided up, and the belief that capitalism couldn't find new markets and couldn't keep expanding. But that particular fact doesn't really find a home in the rest of the theories, right? It's just kind of brought up on its own. Everything else, for example, when he moves on to this next list, right? The concentration production of capital, merging of bank capital with industrial capital, and then number 4, the formation of international monopolist capitalist associations. He discusses that in the terms of concentration and centralization of capital. Likewise, the merging of the export of capital. This was actually analyzed quite a bit at the very beginning of the Second International takes on imperialism, before Lenin and Bukharin were even in it. And I don't have my notes on those guys anymore, unfortunately, but early on, a lot of the writings about imperialism focused on the second volume of Capital, with the imbalance between heavy and light industries, Schedule 1, Schedule 2, and what drives the export of capital. Export of capital was incredibly important to the Bolsheviks' predictions of the future, because that was actually the way that the conditions of proletariat revolution were going to be internationalized. By exporting capital, you export the conditions of the big factories, of the big socializations of labor. The fortress factory idea of the Bolsheviks was being exported for them in their minds by the capitalists. So this kind of centrality of the export of capital is really, really critical. And then you get, oh, I realized I never finished my quote here. And then you get number 5, right? So you've got the first one in terms of kind of the classic dynamics that, you know, Dennis and Gabriel are in the process of mapping out right now. And I don't like, have you actually gotten to concentration centralization?
We're exactly at that point.
Yes, I'm so excited for that, because I'm really curious how that looks in categorical terms. You know, that's always been such
I'm curious as well. No, we're almost there. Yeah, we're getting to it, hopefully.
Sorry, my audio cut out for a second. Where are we?
Centralization and concentration of capital.
Ah, nice. Yes, section 17 of the.
Yeah, we're getting there.
Sweet. Yeah, I'm looking forward to that. So, but yeah, to make a long story short, the first 4 conditions 1, 2, and 4 can be grounded more or less in concentration and centralization. Number 3, more or less in the imbalance of the production of commodities and production, the means of production. But then you get this thing, the filling out of the terms of the world, and particularly not anymore in terms of capitalism, in terms of colonial powers, in terms of military, that is in terms of the state. So number 5, in a sense, is everything that Karatani brings up vis-a-vis like the reduction to capitalism kind of just pops up right there. You have the problem of colonial policy, you have the problem of states facing each other in military, and ultimately you have the ideological problems of nation, because this is going to be so much of what drives the war fever and whatnot of the period, is this idea of whether it's the boxing in and all the tensions prior to World War I, or even like the classic "we need breathing room" from the Nazis, like all these, this particular configuration is going to have a really key part. And again, like Lenin throughout the text, like he continually says as a fact, this is important, but there's no place in the theory to really emphasize it. And the lack of that as you move forward, you know, so I spent a lot of time with attempts to kind of what I would consider good faith scholastic attempts to keep this theory going. Like people that are really trying to do something because they think this is, you know, like I spent several years doing, like thinking this is the best way to like work through stuff. Or some other version, right? Like like there are a lot of rewrites of imperialism. A lot of people have critiqued the stagism and stuff, but I think the tendency that I mapped out here, to go back again, even despite a lot of empirical changes and a lot of shifts, the tendency to look for stages, the tendency to think of everything through capitalism, and, you know, in particular, I guess this is kind of like a, increasingly I'd say a logician's problem, but that's precisely what we're doing. So, but like this question, there really, in a sense, like there is actually no space for this question a lot of times. I mean, there is in Marx, but like if you're actually trying to look at most analyses, like this has been, I'm not even going to pretend to say I understand enough of the mathematical logic or stuff to really cash this out yet and whatnot. But I just find it a really powerful tool. I'm trying to understand things. So, you mentioned last time, Gabriel, that we were talking about specification and the question of like the big organizational point of view versus, and I said I had an idea, and I just wanted to share this as my particular perspective. I'm going to be talking a lot about logistics, and essentially my response to the questions of imperialism and stuff is basically argue that we need to look at the classic epoch of imperialism as an ongoing set of logistical questions that have been posed by the problems of capitalism, states, and nations, right? This triplicate structure that Karatani talks about. And that if we start to ask them in terms of logistics, we're capable of like actually doing things around formalization. And I think we also cut out some questions and make things a little simpler for ourselves in certain ways. So the distinction I'm basically making is, however we end up defining it, like I liked what you said last time, Gabriel, is a loose thing. Like Bogdanov gives us something like, you know, or what we're trying for is something like, you know, logics of worlds plus energy, the organizational point of view like this.
I love that it's actually, it's a definition, it's like very Leninist, like Soviets plus electricity, right?
Yeah, exactly, right? Like
worlds plus electricity.
Exactly, right? And we got an acronym for it too, which is also very Soviet, right? And people will not know what it means. So, so yeah, so there's this, but whatever it is, like there's something, and you know, that's clearly being fleshed out at that level, at the interaction between Bogdanov and Badiou, that's powerful and interesting and engaging, and clearly has a lot of work to do on that level. But there's something there, and then we get to this particular level of social formation. And what I'm calling logistical is just the restriction at the level of a social formation, which is a technological structure, however that's defined, plus the exchange functions. And so once we start to look at logistics, we're really looking at logistics as the kind of point of interaction between whatever we mean generally by social formations in economics and these specific things that we're starting to look at in terms of exchange functions. the logistics as we more or less understand it now is entirely, operations research is entirely conceived of on the scale of quantification that you all are analyzing in the primer, capitalist quantification. And what I sent out in the value stream mapping is a very exact, is a procedural algorithmic example of what it looks like to actually logistically operationalize something like an operative production, where you're actually instantiating an abstract form into reality, and that gives you a feedback mechanism to then modify it over time. But basically my proposal is that we can think of logistics in a more general sense as we begin to explore formally TA and TB in such a way that we can get towards, through categories and through exploring things like the Curry-Howard isomorphism, to a more general perspective on logistics, which gives us, I think, some interesting potentials. So Karatani, by moving from production to exchange, in a certain extent gives us a generalization. And what I'm proposing is a kind of counterposing specification from technology to logistics, in the specific sense that if we go with, at least like Heidegger and a lot of other kind of inspired by that tradition notion of technology, there's this interlinking between technology and use. And Renzo actually brought up on several occasions, like a number of like kind of questions that come up when you start from the perspective of use. And while it's necessary in certain levels, what I'm basically making an argument for is, if we start with what Gabriel and Dennis have accomplished with the primer, and then think of value stream mapping as a kind of logistical operationalization of operads, you can get to logistics without needing use in a certain kind of way, or at least not needing use in a general ontological sense. You can get it within the terms of the quantification of any of the specific exchange functions that we're modeling on, this particular case, TC. And so we're cutting out a certain range of issues, but not losing any of the actual capacity, because what operations research has shown is that you can, it's actually got, like, I wonder if there has been anything on, like, there's something almost parallel to the Turing idea that logistics is essentially, what makes something logistical is it can solve a problem that's posed in logistical terms. Like, once beyond that, like, I actually pulled off good old fashioned Oxford Dictionary. You have the two kind of historical origins of logistics, oops, that down below, which are, first and foremost the military, followed then by commercial activity. The real definition is the detailed coordination of a complex operation involving many people, facilities, or supplies, which is just about, depending on how you define many, everything that has to do with economics, everything has to do. And it gives us, I think, the kind of restriction and abstraction of a logic, or of the logical model, without losing capacity to do what we're trying to do, which is to come up with the capacity to plan and to do so collectively or democratically or whatnot. And so, so in a sense, trying to think of logistics is just a hair more general than it is right now, but similar to comments that you've made, Gabriel, about like philosophy of mathematics versus the kind of stuff Badiou does, like, I'm really interested in like what logistics actually does right now in capitalism. Like, how does it actually work?
This is very interesting. I would just add just one comment there to the definition. I just sent you two texts here by Alberto Toscano, who, there is this guy who developed something called the logistics hypothesis in communization theory, which I like a lot. And there is this guy called, I think it's called Sergio Bologna, an Italian guy, who wrote a couple of books on politics and logistics. And one thing that I like a lot in the way that they define logistics, just to give it some specificity, is that they go back to the military example, and they show that, well, the point is logistics is a way to create a system of support in an enemy territory. What does that mean? In fact, it's not simply any system of support, of supplies, of resources, and so on. It's a system of support and resources that for example, an army can depend on without being determined by. So, for example, if you are in an enemy territory, you want to decide when to strike based on the best time for a strike, on the imminent logic of a battle. You don't want to strike after dinner or after lunch, right? You want lunch, dinner, resources to accommodate the inner logic of battle. So you cannot have a battle without food for the troops, but you need an inverse arrow between determination and dependence, where armies depend on food, but the food does not determine the army. Right? You want it's a that's I think that's what gives, in my opinion, the specificity of logistics, which is the idea that you can create a network of an infrastructure that in some sense does not constrain the thing that it structures. Right? On the contrary, it allows for some sort of internal constraint to develop. Right? So again, if you're cooking for a whole troop, you want to minimize it's not enough that you bring the food. That wouldn't be a proper logistical operation. You need to bring the food, store it, work with it in such a way that it doesn't get in the way of battle strategy. Right? And I think that this inverse arrow is very important because what Henri Lefebvre used to call the logistical state, and what, again, Toscano studies, which is this sort of weird capitalist landscapes where everything you point to, for example, in a port, like I think it's called port, right, where the ships arrive and so on.
Yeah, port.
Everything you point to has some function, but at the same time, it's weirdly alien, kind of univalent space, right?
Yeah.
It's meant to facilitate the passage of commodities without damaging commodities, making like space and time contract so that commodities are not idle for long. So the circuit of the cycle of production and consumption is constrained. But again, it's allowing for things to happen, but determining them the least possible, right?
Yeah.
And I think that connection between being the infrastructure that allows a process to happen while not interfering in the process that you're allowing to happen, right? It's very specific. Like, it's very different from, let's say, public policy or law, right? Where law and things like this, they seem to be all about constraining how things happen, right? But you talk about logistics precisely when you're trying to change the logistical system to accommodate the thing that is going through the circuit, right? So, I don't know, the logistic of transportation, you get these guys driving trucks for inhumane amount of hours per day, you know, to accommodate the fact that commodities cannot stop on the road. Like, so it's interesting to see this inversion between logics and logistics, where logic seems to be all about a system of constraint, and logistics seems to be about the material dependence of a logic on something that is trying not to determine that logic, trying to allow that logic to have some free-flowing or some interior dynamics, right? That you're not constraining in too many ways, right?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's a really interesting conceptual approach to asking questions about like why linear programming, optimization, simplex, like these particular methods work in logistics, and what it would mean for us to like because you're inevitably going to raise the question of like quantification, and you need something like this at the level, and that's kind of, let me shift elsewhere real quick. This has to do with the definition that I've been trying to flesh out for a while, and this is just an attempt to give it recursively, which is this: the computerization is like a concrete process of building computing machines, which would be both software and hardware, and integrating them through progressive transformations of the social domains to which they are added. So that means the focus is on changing the domains to fit the needs of computers, to enable computerization of that regime. So in other words, you do all this in order to then set problems and then redefine the terms on top of that. So you're never like, you never actually get done with the problem of computerizing on some level, though I'm trying to ask the question. There's a question about like termination, but that's secondary. My main question is like, when we're talking about logistics and computerization is, and in particular, like this question of dependency and determination is a good way to put it, because that's there's a level of the actual like social construction of the way that we make things capable of being quantified for computation, that I think that particular level, what the primer seems to be implying is that that particular level is where we have to like ask the questions of the exchange function. Is that there's this level of the exchange function that we're asking the perspective of quantification. Once we get there, the computational questions can then be asked, and a lot of them will be implementation details, and a lot of them will have some important structural ramifications, but that has to come in some sense later too. The quantification through exchange functions, does that seem like a fair interpretation?
Yeah, I think the one thing to add here is that the exchange function leads us, along with the lattice structure, it leads us to a formulation of a sheaf. And from the sheaf, it leads to a formulation of a topos. And every topos has inside of it basically its own type theory and its own like way of being computerized, let's say. Okay. So there's actually like a straight line between the exchange function to like a logical language that could be possibly like put into a computer, compiled.
So this is pretty tight then. We can run a pretty tight line from exchange function to the actual practical questions of computation on this.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. I mean, I don't know the specifics on how to do it.
The thing is, I'm just a bit lost though, because sometimes I feel like we're talking about, you mentioned like, there's Thiago is joining. You mentioned in the beginning, just see if I'm following kind of the whole thing. Like you mentioned this sort of, we began with Lenin and this idea that whatever he was talking about in terms of party structure, it seemed like it was much more sophisticated than it seems at first glance. It might require a very weird sort of approach between parts and centralization, decentralized parts and centralized information and things like this. Then we spoke of some examples of, you know, how the sort of decentralized, more like social network or hyperlink based sort of networks seem to have something to some interest to this sort of organizational challenge. And you mentioned that you thought that this sort of means of networking, so to speak, that are kind of like online, not online, but internet structures, they are more interesting in terms of having some subversive power that should be harnessed than some other structures, right? And up to that point, I understand that it's almost like a sort of strategic definition of a problem of organization on one hand, then a look into a possible kind of resource, both in terms of borrowing methods from a sort of more networked approach to organization with internet, but also sort of strategic, interesting, concrete target, right? I mean, these structures exist, they should be the focus of politics and so on. But then there was a small jump, which I think you're seeing it as a more concrete thing, but from my perspective, perhaps I didn't catch it very well. Okay. So it seems like it's a bit of a metaphor, because one thing for me is, I agree with you that these systems should be thought not as online spaces, but first of all, as a sort of logistical standpoint, right? I would even say that we should probably define the difference between the organizational and the logistic points of view, because of course they are complementary, but as you suggested, logistics seems to be a more specific set of questions about organizations, right? We're focusing on something, and I have the impression, and that's where I think it splits to me between metaphor and and something more defined, which is how does, I mean, even if you define, and from the text that you showed us, I had the impression that that's where you were heading. Even if we define logistics in the sense of the sort of infrastructure of, you know, actual implementation of processes, right? And we call logistics the sort of instantiation of abstract forms in the world, which I think, I mean, nothing screams, you know, concrete abstraction as much as a container for me. Like, for me, that's like the monument to the abstract. Just, you know, this perfect box that turns any concrete thing into a sort of standard unit and makes it flow so easily through a certain circuit of transportation, right? But so on one hand, it seems like logistics is a matter of making processes happen, right? From the most kind of down to earth, step by step approach, one in which we don't want to be separating abstractions from concreteness. It's not a matter of saying forget abstract value economy. Yeah. This is like logistics is where you see the abstraction carving reality, right? Mm-hmm. You want to kind of build a hallway in, like, the hallway is defined the way that it is there, and the speed people move through it, it's all defined by abstract concerns. So it's shaping like a factory, it's shaping a road, it's shaping, but all of that seems to put logistics, let's say, in the service of something that it cannot determine because it's determining it, right? In the sense that the inner logics of this abstract stuff is kind of beyond logistics. Logistics is more implementing. And the other versions where this thing should be kind of computable or reducible back. So my point is that this when we get to this computerization example and the sort of equivalence between processes in the general sense of practical processes, right, which are also abstract in some sense because they're constrained by abstractions, and processes in the computing sense. Like at that point, it seems like we move from saying, for example, when I'm working on in a store, somebody hands me a fragile item, and I'm very careful with it, putting it on the table. The thing I'm looking at is not because the thing is beautiful and I want to preserve it. It's because the value of the thing needs it to be exactly as it is in time. So I need to preserve it, right? Or when I put things in the shelf, they need to be kept from the passage of time because their value is not determined by time. So you need to kind of make the store an abstract space to accommodate abstraction, so to speak, right? But that's a very vague sense of abstraction that doesn't imply that you can, let's say, compute anything in a more technical sense. You don't need to be able to do that, right? Or you can do it to some point. Like if I put the vase, the expensive vase on the table, and I damage it a bit, I don't need to be able to calculate exactly, unless, you know, in a very specific sense, and for that particular thing, you have a way of dividing the vase and defining how much each part of it is about. So I'm just trying to understand, like, is computerization here a metaphor for concrete processes that are constrained by abstract determinations, you know, and that are step-by-step, constructive, no bullshit sort of construction? Or are we talking about
properly algorithmic?
Yeah, or is it like hardcore algorithmic in some sense, you know?
Yeah, I mean, I think, so I mean, first off, I guess let me give you ideas of what I'm thinking about, and then maybe because I'm not quite. Because I think, like, for example, just you look at the process in the 80s of like conversion of offices with desktop computers, and you have like kind of in general like two levels of things that start to happen. You have things that have, there's a kind of conversion of kinds of records that were kept from paper files to digital files, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, there's some adjustments there. But there's also ranges of questions that come up that can now be done because of computers that weren't available before, whatever that might be. Like I'm trying to say it very generally, because the idea is in part that there's this kind of back and forth between there's this existing set of quantifications that needs to occur, but the very kind of like nature of programming, of its universality and whatnot, is such that like the moment you begin to quantify and produce the data structures and actually like, again, I think it's like it would fall under computing in the sense that the whole point is that it can somehow be converted into a record, I guess would be the clearest way to put it, for computation, whether that's simple CRUD functions, all you're doing is looking up someone's file, or actual like complex data analysis. The point being that it's actually being converted into digital data to be worked upon in some function. That entails like actual transformations of society, which are cumulative, like things are layering on top of each other. I'm not proposing any kind of methodology, but I'm saying that there must be some kind of like recurring function, like recurring thing that is occurring. Sorry, these are horrible word choices, but like this thing that's happening over and over again.
Oh my God, please, you need to invent the word occurring to join occurring with occurrence.
Right. You know, so it's also important though, because like part of my interest is more just like historical and rethinking writing history from the perspective of a lot of this stuff. You know, that's part of the big intrigue for me just personally with Karatani's book, is it's very interesting to rethink a lot of classic questions from it. But most of what we understand by computers, as well as most of the methodologies of modern logistics, come out of the period that we identify as imperialism. So part of the idea of looking back at the stuff with Lenin and the ways of thinking about imperialism is imperialism itself has thought about problems in terms of computation. It has thought about problems in terms of logistics. And I'm arguing that like, to a certain extent, like that is, so let me jump. Well, let me like, so that's, I also wanted to clarify something before I jump, that I realized it was vague and makes more sense now to clarify, which is, I want to argue that there's a mutual dependency between the kind of like freely associative, creative, dynamic thing that happens in Wikipedia and the kind of centralization that I was talking about, particularly with regulatory bodies, which also occurs with Wikipedia. You also have a standards body, which is tiny compared to the total number of people that participate. And they're specialists on informatics and like they, again, it's not simply a representation of the participants in a classic, like, you know, a part of the, it's a decision based upon technical capacities that has to bear in mind the people that are using it in a particular kind of way. And that those two things actually mutually require each other. The standardization enables the level of creativity and the emergence of these kind of structures that I was talking about that are interesting in Wikipedia. Without that standardization, you can't have that kind of thing. So to clarify that, that's kind of, and that's what I think is missing in Karatani, and there's something missing when you just look at the problems in terms of commodity exchange and gift exchange. That there's something.
Yeah, I totally agree with you there.
And so that's what I. Yeah.
Sorry, yeah. When you gave the example of Wikipedia before, I think that one thing that really caught my attention is that, and I think it's a really good comparison with Karatani, which is Karatani, I think he does two things to kind of skip step and to make things easier. I would say three things that are, my opinion, problematic with his account of that mode D. One is that he calls it a mode, as if there is this thing that is already kind of structured and you're just gonna kind of allow it to become the dominant form. And that seems to posing a lot, and he needs to build all that idea that there is something that's going to return from a nomadic life. That's like a lot of contemporary philosophy stuff that it reads nice, but I mean, okay. So I say that that's a problem, like assuming it is consistent. So you don't need to create a consistency because it's there. Yeah. Then I think that with the gift structure, he does something that I know a lot of friends who do it as well. Who, I mean, anything that is not state or capital is good. So if it's gift economy, it's probably that good. So why not borrow from non-capitalist stuff that we already know, so it seems like it's going to tap into something that we already are or have or know, like with the gift. And I think that the third thing, which is where Kant comes in to kind of tie all of this together, which is this idea of I think it's a good idea, but I think it's articulated in the worst way, which is he brings the gift together with Kant to say that you are always capable of kind of preparing your action to be taken up by another. So it's not logistics, but it's ethics that guarantees that a network is available for others to interact with. So why is it that our movement will connect with some other movement on the left? It's because we're acting in accordance to a gift with no reciprocity. So we are towards the other, right? In the whole Derrida Kant gift stuff that he's building there. So it's kind of, we're always setting up the stage for others to pick up what we're doing. And this is already inherently consistent. So this will always kind of build.
Yep.
I think that once you kind of empty out the philosophical kind of romanticism of it all, you're left with a logistical problem. Exactly, which is exactly as you said in Wikipedia, like it's a good example of a network that already constrains, like the very constraints on how you can add to it, also make the addition better, right? It's not a extrinsic constraint, right? To find a way to link your new page to all older pages is part of producing the knowledge of that page, right? So it does give a sort of example of a network that the more you build it, the more it constrains further additions in an objective way that don't require ethics. It's just the only way to do it, right? That has a slightly different kind of approach to the economy of something, of the way it connects things, and that the consistency is constructive, is not transcendental, right? It's not given that it's consistent. You need to actually do it, right? So I totally see the connection there between, especially with what you said. I mean, I'm sorry if I'm talking too much. I'm just
Oh, that's fine. This is precisely why I wanted to bring this up. Is
because like the whole thing with the peripherization thesis. There is this version of the argument which I like very much, which also Karatanis plays with, but I think that he ends up going in a slightly different way, which is you can kind of take these three big sequences of capitalism, right? Market capitalism, monopoly or imperialist phase, and then you have this late crisis, crazy capitalism we have now. And you can map it onto some tendencies simultaneously, right? So to have this sort of three periods, you can talk about market capitalism as a very long, slow phase going from 1400s to, I don't know, 1800s, 1900s, right? Where the big shift was a sort of emptying out of transcendence to a kind of realist standpoint, right? In terms of kind of aesthetics and ideology. At the same time, this was possible because the world, the structure of the world, of the capitalist world was still of the same size as the experience of that world. So in 1500, I'm still living in very small cities. I'm seeing the market grow in space and power and so on, but the size of things is kind of compatible with my size, right? And you get that sort of size of the world, this compatibility between structure and experience, all the way to monopoly capitalism and early in the 1900s and so on, where then Frederick Jameson says, well, we have the first big kind of tension with cognitive mapping because the size of the world is very large and experience doesn't grow accordingly, right? And you no longer have like a realist aesthetics to go with it. It's not the time of realist romances trying to redescribe the world without transcendence. You actually get modernism as, let's say, a lot of different strategies to break away from experience in the name of a structure, right? So formalisms of all sorts of aesthetic experiments that say that the self-reflexive or the self-conscious immediate experience is a lie, is the false life, and you only kind of residue of authenticity that's left is if you kind of go beyond your experience, right? It's a big kind of topic of modernism. But Jameson says that they still have one kind of underlying assumption, which is that you only need one operation to go from experience to structure. There is one structure, right? And monopoly capitalism kind of helps with that because it is a promise of the generalization of one structure as a global structure, right? So no wonder that it gives you the idea that if you know how capital functions in one place, you know how it functions everywhere, because it's all about the generalization of these basic principles, right?
Yeah.
And then the idea is that with late capitalism, you no longer have simply the rupture between experience and structure. So structure is very big and our experience is limited. So the rupture is not only between experience and structure, but it's also the rupture of structure with itself, because you have many structures all over the place. They don't really match up, right? Nothing guarantees that the way oppression, domination works in one part of the world is tending towards looking the same as in somewhere else, right? You can get something like the peripherization thesis that says that, well, this fragmented space, it's itself of social form that is generalizing, but with no common overall structure. And so once you have the sort of three moments, I think that you get to where the reason why logistics is so interesting and why it becomes a problem, like most authors that deal with it explicitly deal after the 70s. Like, it's because in the market capitalism phase, where structure was pretty much the size of experience, or you could even say that experience was larger than structure, because you still had feudal experience, you had a sort of religion transcendence that was being kind of was becoming more and more conflicted with capitalism. So, for example, the revolutionary feel of sort of messianic movements was anti-capitalist, wasn't capitalism itself. So you could look to the past to find inspiration for the future, right? So you had a very revolutionary kind of approach, which can still draw from the past to think the future. And I think that monopolist capital, it offers something different, which is the idea that capitalism will kind of cover the globe. And as it covers the globe, it creates the conditions for its overcoming, right? So you have like our heroes in the Second and Third International thinking that, well, as the war breaks, the World War, it will create a homogeneous proletariat that doesn't really identify with any of the countries. So it's kind of preparing the ground for us to do something, right? And I think that that's kind of the big kind of presupposition of a lot of 20th century leftist politics, which is capitalism does the homogenization, we do the politicization. Like, capitalism makes everyone suffer the same, we then tell people that capital did it. You know? And I think that this is the funny thing about what's happening after the 70s, which is capital requires less and less that homogeneity to function because of these sort of fragmented global structures. So if you want to politicize, you need to do the homogenizing first. So you cannot count on capital to do it for you. And it's interesting because social reproduction theory emerges, right? Feminist autonomist movements emerge, right? This sort of standpoint of logistics as something that is not simply a dimension of capitalist development, but something that we kind of need to take hold of. It's all emerges in the moment that capital no longer kind of worries about creating a social homogeneity. Otherwise, it cannot valorize, right? It doesn't need to organize the labor force, global labor force, as we thought we would have, right? And it's interesting that the moment that this sort of task of homogenization of the terrain is left out of the picture, then we start worrying about this, you know? So I feel like there is a very, very strong kind of connection between the period where it was all about logics and computation, which was the monopoly capitalism. We were all about, you know, socialist calculation, central planning. You know, if you guys can rule with one global structure, why can't we? Kind of mirroring.
Yeah, I mean, and you see continually reference to the idea of like monopolies as the intermediary stage to socialism, that they're
exactly.
And even if it's not intended in the better documents, it does become a teleology in most people after a while.
Exactly. Exactly. That's the whole point, I think. That I mean, you even get a feeling for this today when people say, "Look at Walmart. It's like a logistical monopoly. Why can't we just nationalize it?" There is a field that is kind of the same kind of monopoly as the intermediate step towards, you know, proper planning.
Exactly. And I think there is something of that logic that I like when it does come to studying particular parts of these regulative bodies in the internet, but that's because they meet a very different constraint than the corporation that became the model. Like they exist in a very strange space of like an equilibrium between competition. And so their whole point is to kind of like stabilize a set of regulations that take a bunch of different quote unquote stakeholders. And that's actually kind of what this part is here, because I've been, you know, one of the implications I've been exploring in terms of the exchange functions and the way that you all have developed the primer is this idea of how the objects of a particular exchange transcendental appear to one another, right? Like you start within the objective phenomenology of how commodities appear to one another. We can then talk about how capital and labor appear to one another, how capitals appear to one another, and so on and so forth. And so that's the approach I've been trying to take. And I think that, how, you know, I'm not saying that this is ready-made and requires the same kind of critical working through that an engagement with political economy does, but I think that the science of geopolitics has essentially provided the raw material of how state actors, how these kind of actors appear to one another. That's the logic, however well or not well in a given geopolitical text is trying to put down. That is what they are trying to map, is the logic of appearance at TB. And so what I'm proposing is, on the one hand, that requires that we come up with a concept of TB and a logic of it that can follow the same kind of rigor that, you know, unless of course, I suppose you can, or you could formalize it to prove you can't do it. But it seems to me that you could do so. But also that there might, like, certain constructions could look different. So this is an idea of a particular construction. Because in this idea of like, what do we retain from these things we're trying to overcome? I really like the idea of the bargaining space as this accomplished mathematical categorical object that we can actually talk about that comes out of the commodity exchange and yet isn't capital, doesn't require the relation of capital, and is something that we can talk about, you know, as an experimental space to do more with, which is I think how we talked about it in one of the meetings when you brought it up. So what it would be to like construct a space, not from the perspective that decisions are made for a commodity, which is a bargaining space, but the decisions that are being made from the perspective of this kind of idea I'm coming up with, regulation and administration, in the sense of like an internet body or something. And I think one of the things I've pulled out that are significant is that when you're talking about a decision around regulation, for all practical purposes, they're not reversible. When you're laying down a new level of logistical infrastructure, that's a pretty strong commitment in the way that, and any given decision, you know, like there are these big decisions, but really if you think about it, if you're looking at an administrative regulatory body, any decision they make has a set of cascading effects that don't involve the people, which is number two, that are making them. So those two things are, like, all these things I think have to be thought together, because the third part is that differentiates it from any given, you know, committee that has too much power, is that the decisions have to actually be formally articulated in terms of the other, and that other is a statistical subject. So in the case of a postal service, they have a statistical entity that is, or a set of statistical entities that are their clients, right? They're not dealing with the sum total of everyone they deliver postal service to. They're delivering with, they're developing their systems to constructed statistical entities, not abstract political subjects, but actual entities with actual formalized needs and interests. Likewise, when you're talking about users of an internet system, you can specify the actual users statistically, and you can then from there begin to come up with studies about how you're actually going to accomplish. And I think that there's something when we look at the administrative apparatus, you know, the bureaucracy at its worst, you know, which is how it manifests under conditions of class and whatnot, but like the idea of an administrative tool that comes out of that reasoning, that's essentially what I'm trying to get at. I know it's all very vague right now, but
no, but I think that there is something that we were talking about last time that I'm not sure how Dennis feels about this. Like, we didn't really discuss this much, but it's something that I was talking to Thiago a bit about, and then after that it really stuck to me with me as a way of summarizing this whole kind of approach we're taking, like, which is this idea that you kind of define a logic that has no guarantee of consistency. So for example, our exchange function, which can very easily become inconsistent, and then you discover the sort of network of relations, but relations wouldn't be the right term, but the sort of what sort of strain or what sort of paths are such that if you were to use them as the grid for that logic, it would have a higher chance of being a consistent logic. So this is a way of talking about the fact that a commodity exchange does not require commodity production. You can have commodity exchange, and we have commodity exchange where you don't have production. So in a sense, commodity exchange is independent of production, which is kind of a weird non-Marxist thesis. But productive relations are the sort of proper support. They increase the chance of consistency of the exchange function, because if commodities are producing commodities and there is some sort of feed forward structure or some sense of constraining further commodity productions because they are made of commodities, this process starts to organize the commodity space and makes it consistent in a large scale. So you kind of mix logic that might be inconsistent on its own with the sort of lineament of that logic, right?
Yeah.
And that lineament gives it its consistency. It's not the cause of the logic, but it's something like the material support of its consistency, right?
Yeah,
and when I was talking to Thiago about this, it seemed to me that this is something that with a bit of sweat we can work into the understanding of kinship structure, symbolic exchange. It has a similar feel. And from what you're saying, I feel like we could do something similar with what we call the B transcendental, right? If we find on one hand what we call and I really like, I mean, I think it's totally unmotivated because that's not how you present it, but there is a nice feel to it, which is the approach that I was kind of tending towards, that I was kind of pushing without being able to properly explain, was actually the idea that the sort of contract transcendental or the state transcendental should be Boolean, should be yes or no. And I feel that the reason for this is actually because you either have contract or you don't. You either are committed or you're not. Like you cannot be half committed. Of course, you can have very complex things you're committed to, a bunch of conditionals. But once you've signed, you've signed. There is no half signing a contract. There is not half making an agreement. So it would be a yes or no logic, but it's a very inconsistent thing because on its own, you can easily come to the situation where I made an agreement with you and you made an agreement with a third party and they didn't make an agreement with me, and that fucks everything up. So we would have to find out what is the material support for Boolean commitments. And I think that logistics, it's a pretty good kind of name for that, for what production is for political economy, what kinship is for reciprocity. Logistics could be a very good name for in the case of what about the material world can truly be like kind of assume the form of this abstract logic. Like what in the world is porous to that specific form of abstraction, right?
I'll be right back, and then I'll jump more specifically into TB.
Okay. I don't know. I might be going totally off the rails with this, but since like a lot of theoreticians of contemporary states and this sort of increasing decoupling of centralized power, which is like the classic discussion of state power, democratic power, and things like this, and towards the sort of materially ingrained institutional apparatus, right, with the logistical, what they call the logistical state. I think it might be a possible way to go about it.
All right. Well, cool. It sounds like we got a lot of resonance going on. So I'm going to ruin the mood by talking about Hegel. We all know that. That really does the. So Karatani talks about Hegel, right? And specifically, in terms of the theory of the state, he talks about the philosophy of right. And I'm going to set that aside for a second. Because there's another place that Hegel gets into the state that I think is really interesting to actually think through in terms of the lattices and the transcendentals, which is in the section of spirit of the phenomenology of spirit. And that is, by Hegel's own account, the moment when history actually starts in the phenomenology. Everything up until then is formal constructions to a certain degree. However much that doesn't seem to make sense since he talks about, Stoics and consciousness and the fight to the death. There is this sense that he's building up a structure to then enable the explanation. And I think like part of what Karatani's work is is rethinking what we mean when we think of Hegel as the philosopher of the state. I think is like really trying to think through, especially like the phenomenology is like not being as universal as Hegel thought, but being very good at dealing with TB in a kind of way. In this way that I'm trying to get at here, that there's something that we can extract, I think helps to kind of like give an interesting restriction on Hegel, but also pull something out of him. So the conflicts of the lattice formations, i.e. states, other things. So ethics, we've got the classic battle between Antigone and Creon. And it's even articulated in something that Karatani clarifies is to do with kinship relations, which are the rights of the dead. And there's this obligation that has been put upon Antigone by a kinship relationship that has to do with a symbolic discharge of obligation that literally means more to her than her life, versus Creon, who embodies the very perspective of like the state. There is a crisis. Her brother represents a threat to the state, you know, in the kind of like Schmittian thing, which I'll come back to. He falls under enemy. He falls under that bullion, precisely that bullion. He's on the other side of that, and that's a non-disputable thing. And the conflict there, you know, ends in disaster. So then you move to culture, and you have the initial kind of battle between the kind of wit and irony and the knights of true faith and whatnot. And that really kind of embodies the conflicts within France prior to the French Revolution, which represented the way that kinship had been retained within the feudal order that Karatani talks about, the remains of the aristocrats who've lost their feudal powers and are living as, you know, in salons as wits and conversationalists within France. And then the absolute state that has taken upon itself the function of determining who is good, who's evil, who's a true God, who's not. That is the Knight of the True Faith. But then with that split itself merges into the other split, which is the split between, which Karatani again talks about, the transformation of the absolute state into the bourgeois state through the process of the revolution. And the way that Hegel maps that out in terms of abstract individuality, right? Like what happens with the Jacobist terrors, you get this idea of the individual, which ends up itself becoming a threat, because anyone can fill in the space of the abstract individual and become a threat to the Jacobist terror. And that becomes unresolved. And what is morality? I'm arguing that morality is actually a pretty interesting way to think through the capital state nation relationship. And I'll come back to this stuff here, but I want to jump right here. So generally speaking, when you read the philosophy of right, or you read the section of morality in Hegel, those are treated as inner subjective states: purpose and responsibility, intentional well-being, and good conscience. My argument is that these are actually objects for the state. When you talk about a police investigation, they're looking to establish motive, which is essentially intention, right? They're looking, when you're talking about a police interrogation, the suspect's conscience is an object for the police officer, right? When you're talking about, you know, the title of this is Spooks and Pigs Towards a Theory of Personification TV. And my idea is that the police on the domestic level and intelligence officers on the foreign level represent in a more pure way the structure of TV, and the way that Marx gives a very clear, you know, he defines what is a capitalist. A capitalist is a personification of capital. It's not that capital is a product of a capitalist effort. The capitalist is the outcome of a way of capital. I'm arguing that the police and intelligence, which really, especially modern intelligence networks, really only come out at after the emergence of what we understand as Karatani's capital nation state, like the whole triplicate structure. Then you get things like the Central Intelligence Agency, MI6, like, you know, and as, I mean, I'm everyone, like the CIA has done far more damage than just about any other group. And if you look at the CIA compared to, say, like the military, the CIA actually has much more of a function of determining, quote, who's good and who's bad. It's the CIA that informs the president. These are our friends right now, Mr. President. Yesterday, they were our enemies, but now they're our friends. Tomorrow, we might have to kill them, but for today, they're our allies. And that's their job, much more so than the military that provides a kind of like, it serves a function, but it's much less concerned with determining actually who's good and bad than intelligence operatives. Each of the moments, both in the philosophy of right and in the morality section of phenomenology of spirit, end on the problems of what I'm going to call the real citizen, dissemblance in the phenomenology and hypocrisy in the philosophy of right. And again, it tends to be in the literature, it's looked at as this kind of like internal state a lot of times. What I'm arguing is that this is precisely the problem that gets posed to the triplicate, you know, capital nation state thing after it comes, is the problem of a real citizen, a real or a true or a good citizen, which always, when you get into a crisis, a state of exception, that becomes, it's no longer determining, if it ever really was, what you did that was good or bad, you know. And this is where the show trials of Stalin are like, you know, tend to be the cited example, you know. Guilt has already been established. Now we're going to determine motive. Now we're going to determine what you actually did. But guilt has already been established. And with that kind of like Boolean, you're either in or you're out. There's no like halfway being shot, right? You're going to either be in or you're going to be out. And so from there, I think within Karatani, he's I don't say he's actually makes the mistake, but he's not clear enough, I think, in distinguishing between an internal external and interior exterior. And I just went with internal external internal external is the more general, because Bogdanov had that great line about his non-spatial notion of external, so I chose that. But it could have easily been flipped. So, you know, sometimes you just you got to choose, right? So Karatani, the autonomy of the state only becomes visible when grasps the state in relations to other states. It's independent will. So in other words, you can't, the state exists in relation to other states and it exists as a state. That's how we have to understand that. But there's a danger there, I think, of seeing that solely in terms of organized full-on states facing organized full-on states. And so one of my areas of research for the last several years has been Turkey, the Kurdish question, Erdogan, all this stuff. And if you look at, especially under the last 20 years of Erdogan's presidency, the role of the Kurds versus the PKK, right? Like the PKK is precisely the filter. In your Boolean example, Gabriel. If you're PKK, you're a bad Kurd. And if you are not PKK, you're a good Kurd. And that's like the fundamental filter. It helps if you like Erdogan, but really the real decider is like, what is your stance on the PKK? The PKK is, I mean, certainly there are members that aren't in Turkey, but it is an intra-Turkic organization, right? Like it is within Turkey in the sense that I mean in the secondary sense, interior, exterior. But in the sense that I am citing an article that Dennis sent me on Mereology. In a Mereological sense, the PKK is external to the Turkish state. And that is what is fundamental. And so what I'm arguing is that this filter, this binary on the friend-enemy distinction or what have you, and elsewhere, Karatani, I've got the quote somewhere. Yeah, here it is. In the same way, so he's saying that the friend-enemy distinction, that binary distinction is, in his view, motive exchange B. But that has to be fundamental. And then you build a distinction between foreign and domestic on top of that. But, you know, in my own country's example, like, you know, if I go back here to the second point, COINTELPRO, right? This is the domestic counterpart to the CIA. This was the FBI's project to destroy, you know, Black civil rights, environmental anti-war activists in the 60s and 70s. This is a domestic program. This is internal in that territorial sense, but this is precisely the process of filtering on interior, or it's interior but not internal. That's my point. It's within the territory, but it's not a part of the state from the perspective of the state, right? In this sense, it doesn't really matter who the other person views themselves. You know, there were plenty of people that viewed themselves as good Americans that were identified as communists and lives were destroyed, for example, right? Or identified as terrorist threats and they, you know, et cetera, et cetera. Like there's all these examples, but the point is the filtering from the perspective of the state in the calculus. And that's why something like the PKK is interesting, right? Because this isn't a full-on state. It's not even like a state in exile. It's a proto-state. It's a potential state. It's something that could one day be a state, but it operates as an agent or as an entity in the calculations of the Turkish state more than most bona fide nation states. And
but one question, sorry, just to understand better, like I understand this idea of, for example, you know, intelligence agencies that work in their domain of operations is inside the state, right? But wouldn't you just say in that case that that you need to account for two domains at the same time, the state and the community level? I mean, especially with, you know, counterintelligence work against the Black Panthers and things like this. You had an explicit problem with the Black nation and the idea of creating a community that is not really inside the United States in a way. So couldn't we just account for this by introducing the fact that, you know, you need to look at the community logic and the state logic together? Why make that kind of extimate or the internal that is external point of view fully defined by the state logic and not by the interaction between the two?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's a very good point. And I think that has to do with the way that the nation state is never this fully separate thing. And I think there's a lot of question there. That's a really good point. Like, I don't really have a full answer there. I think the main point isn't like, even if we end up saying that this is articulated more on TA than TB or whatnot, the point is that it is these state agencies that are operating that bullion. Now, that bullion might be a bullion on another level, you know, in the same way that intelligence agencies also often determine who's a good trade partner for the United States.
Yeah, but my point is that, for example, just to lay the cards on the table, like, my point is that, you know, for the last 50 years, every theoretician has made their object of work contradictory. So everyone wants to have the crazy logic. So communities have an inside that is outside. States have an inside that is outside. Capital is an inside. So when you start formalizing stuff, it all looks the same. So I just want things to, like, can any of these logics take the short stick and assume that their logic is consistent, classical, you know, black and white? Otherwise, everything is inconsistent and self-referential. So my point is that it could be the case that we get to the same properties we're looking for simply by talking about how nation state works. So you get this sort of weird perspective, kind of dissemination of groups that are outside but inside, depending where you're looking from and so on, through the nation kind of more communitarian logic. And then you have a tension of that when you try to map it onto a state that is not allowed to say more than you belong or you don't. Like, you can't really come up with a third category. Like, I think that actually explains a lot of the problems that the state has, because it can't really create a third thing. Like, it can only push you to the outside.
You're in or you're out. You're good or you're bad.
Yeah, I mean, but the problem is that the terrain that it's naming is not black and white. So you get all weird sorts of, I mean, this reminded me a lot of an idea that Dennis and I had the other day. We were starting to develop the, can I just share the screen very quickly here?
Yeah, do I have to stop?
I think I just, because we were thinking of how to further develop the multi-layered transcendental, and we had this idea of, so imagine here you have like yes or no, right? This would be the V transcendental. Here you have this, like, two things are indistinguished. They belong to the same interior, or they are divided, which would be our logic for communitarian spaces. And then you have the capitalist one, which is intuitionistic. It's an interval between minimal and maximum, right? But then you can imagine how these things are projected onto each other. And you can imagine that there is something called the nation-state capital, which sees these three things. So, for example, you value, right? We know that things can be more or less equal in terms of value, but the state doesn't work with more or less value. It only works with you make a commitment or you don't, right? So you have an interaction here between property alienation, which works with it's either yours or it's not. There is no other way, right? And value. So you can imagine, how could you map this sort of intuitionist thing onto two values, right? Or, for example, what you're talking about right now, right? You have sort of the logic of sovereignty and commitment. Oh, okay, I wrote a random word here. So the logic of sovereignty and so on. And you have here the weird possibilities of how to organize communities, where you can have one community and inside of it is another community, but this community is not recognized by the first one. So it's kind of like it's outside. You know, this sort of thing would, you can formalize it with these three values here. let's call it a perspectivist approach, right? But then how do you can collapse this onto this, right? And then we came up with an example of what it means to occupy, like what it means to have to navigate three logics at the same time. Like what would it mean to be an object that is intrinsically an object of a nation state capital formation, right? And we thought of, let's say, the modern juridical system. So for example, sentences, they are intuitionistic, right? You're either fully guilty, but you can be more or less guilty all the way to not guilty. It's still absolute commitment, because once you're that, once the sentence is given, it was given. But at the same time, it tries to mimic a sort of cost logic, right? It kind of interprets punishments through a cost structure. If you hurt people in the amount of so much, you need to pay something that is equivalent to it, right? At the same time, it has the way that it segregates people, it's actually mimicking this, right? It's mimicking a sort of inside, outside, or a total homosexual kind of structure, right? Where you're not simply, for example, in prison, you're not even distinguished as a prisoner, right? So indistinct, which is something that you're kind of, again, projecting from here to here, right? So there is actually a lot of stuff that you can start mapping when you start imagining that it's good to start from these things being separate, and then imagine the situations in which one thing is projected onto the other, rather than already trying to start with a logic that accounts for all the qualities at once, you know? For example, in this case, the structure of sentences and the way that it segregates populations cannot be truly understood solely by looking at the logic of the state. It's only because the state is mediating between a world that is constructed on top of value relations, but at the same time managing populations that have communitarian and friend and enemy relations and so on, that you get these structures. But they are, let's say, derived structures, right, rather than primitive ones. So, I mean, that's a sort of example of how we could start with a logic of states that is kind of simpler, right? As in this way, we were talking about, it actually either assumes a commitment or not. But you still could, through the interaction with other things, arrive at very sophisticated descriptions of inside and outside, and things like what you were talking about, which I think make perfect sense to me. Right? I mean, if you imagine that you have a nation, so this is everything that is inside here counts as one. Everything that is outside is divided from it. So we call this larger space 2. But inside of here, for example, there might be something like this, and we call these two things 0. They're indistinct. So we don't know if this is inside or outside, right? This black militant who identifies with a Maoist leader, is he inside or outside of America? So you can imagine now the problem of the state, which is how do you name this, right? You probably have to name it with, well, like, we're not committed to it, right? The traitor or something. So you can get back to the stuff you were talking about by superposing these logics, you know?
Yeah, no, that makes sense. That makes sense. I think part of the problem is, like, we do have, we're at something, I think, of or just have a different problem when it comes to formalizing TB or TA compared to TC, because, at least in the kind of mapping Karatani does, like the old kinship networks and despotic state systems, which don't exist anymore, were the exemplary models of what those look like before they get run through each other in the way the nation state capital system is, right? So to a certain extent, like, there's going to be an incapacity to find. You know, I mean, not that like capitalism has ever been pure either, but like what Marx was studying was an exemplary form of TC, you know, so much so that he could conflate it with like all, or at least for all practical purposes, conflate it with all exchangeability, right? So I think like when I'm looking at like the police and the intelligence, it's a way to try to find a moment that is quote unquote pure in terms of TV, because I do think a lot of things that tend to get taken, especially like the Marxist theory of the state, which often cites like the courts and whatnot, are, as I think your like that analysis does a really good job, are more composite things, right? So I'm in my attempt of like, not that police and CIA aren't composite long term, but trying to find particular places within the functionalities to try to pull out a good starting place for TV. Like if we're going to,
yeah, you know, but I think that this is the thing that I think you touched on something that is more relevant. I mean, I think that the point of what we could call purity aspect of it is not exactly where you think it is, or at least the way that I'm hearing you, because what I found very interesting now, kind of recollecting the stuff that you presented, is that there is a tendency to assume that centralization of power is the, let's say, basic form of the state. So the pure form of state is the Hobbes kind of idea of social contract, right? The commonwealth by fear. I mean, Karatani actually goes this way as well, right? And I think that there is some truth to this in the sense that it is the minimal stage where two people make a commitment to a third so that they don't need to commit between themselves. Like, I think that's the minimal idea of the state. Like, you abdicate some freedom, right, in the name of a sovereign, and this way the other doesn't have power over you and things like this, right? So yeah, everyone else, but I mean, in Graeber's book on the post office, right, and landing in the post office, the Utopia of Rules. I'm not sure if you saw that one.
I've heard of it. I haven't had a chance to read it though.
He makes a good point, which is just because you have a decentralized structure doesn't make it less imperialist. The actual imperialist states were always decentralized because it's impossible to logistically cover a large kind of area without creating nodes that distribute power. Mm-hmm. So yeah, exactly. Ultimately, when you have a large state network, which is exactly as you said, in my opinion, a logistical network, which is a network to guarantee that resources get pulled from the margins and taken to the center, and military power gets further spatially expanded, right? And some territory is guaranteed. That minimal kind of physiology of a state, it doesn't really imply that the power is central. It implies,
no, that's something I get into, actually. Yeah.
Yeah, it implies that there is some idea of, again, some consistency in the commitments which that network covers, right? Mm-hmm. So if down the line, the city-state that controls the region governs over some people, and I govern over it, I govern over those people, right? That needs to be maintained. But that doesn't mean that I directly govern everyone. You don't need that to have a strong imperial state. So
no, I mean, Karatani talks about that specifically in relation to despotic states, that the agrarian communities were left to self-manage, and that was part of what made them work.
Yeah, exactly. So the logistics is actually, it has the upper hand in the definition of state over pure centralized power in any sense. Mm-hmm. Like, that's not really that fundamental.
And it also resonates with Karatani's critique of Marx's reading of Asiatic despotism, because the states were the ones that are actually carrying out these large-scale projects, and that was kind of their justification in many ways. That's what the basis of any kind of contractual obligation came onto, was their capacity to perform this, which, you know, was I think what's his name, Lewis Mumford. He makes quite a bit of this kind of like the the kind of astounding thing that logistical capacities were in early city-states, that they were really seen as magical in a way. And it's not this simple kind of like ideological thing of like the person empowered deifying themselves. Like obviously that's part of it, but there was something truly mind-blowing at the time when people were seeing these huge projects and these massive like these huge scaffoldings would be built and rivers would be moved, and it was truly like to something we've gotten very like used to, right? There was something that really kind of like brought up this whole kind of like magic. The mystification of the state had a lot to do with like just how mind-blowing these things could be.
It really was, yeah. No, so my point is that I feel like that description of this logistical lineament of a territory, that seems to be closer to what is pure about a state, more than the sort of, let's say, contemporary mixture of that with, the control of populations in a modern sense, which is constantly connected with, immigrant flow of labor, the search for resources everywhere, things like this. So I feel like you touch on something that is quite pure there. In my opinion, is much more, let's say, to the point of what is logically singular than for example, the fact that states have this sort of capacity to turn on, in the interior, because but I might be just trying to, as we say in Portuguese, sell my fish, like propose my own thing, just because it would fit much better the stuff that we're doing now.
Well, I do think I agree with you in large part, but also I guess this is probably the best place to actually bring up my critique of you all. So I'm going to go ahead and share the screen back and just jump into that.
Sure.
Admittedly, a little nervous about it because I have no clue what I'm talking about in so many ways, but here we go. Okay, so I am skeptical about defining specifically the exchange function of TB as contract. And I begin with Karatani as a source because these two quotes kind of give some of the ambiguity around the problem of contract in Karatani. In the first one, he cites Solons that there are two different kinds of contracts, and that the one contract is built upon something that's given, the other is built upon like the hierarchy of the state. Later, he has a three-way distinction where he talks about bilateral, reciprocal, ruler subordinate, and then exchanges contracts mediated by money. And he specifically identifies contracts themselves with TC. And then I make a lot, and this is basically the argument where I hinge all my stuff. The rules come to think of this forced labor or tribute not as something taken of them by force, but rather as counter gifts, obligations offered in return of gifts, favors ruled by the ruler. In other words, the state is established with the transformation of plunder and violent compulsion into a mode of exchange. Now I'm arguing he uses the word mode of exchange because he doesn't have a rigorous distinction between lattice and exchange function there. And that he's saying into a lattice formation and not an exchange function. What I'm arguing is that the exchange function of TB is the plunder and violent compulsion. And actually the binary is not originally the inside or outside. It's kind of what Lacan called the money or your life. It's the binary of like, will you give me this or will I have to kill you? And that is the original basis, which you can conceive of on banditry and actual predation on humans prior to a state, which is one of my main disagreements with actual contracts. Gift exchanges and commodity exchanges pre-exist kinship networks and capitalism, but contracts are products of states. So we need something that can precede states in order to get to a state. And Karatani's own analysis says that the thing that drives the formation of states is the competition posed precisely by a ton of different TB, T lower script or subscript B. Now this also implies another distinction, though I think this is more details, but maybe you all disagree with it, which is in your original Badiou and Marx presentation, whenever you had a superscript X, it was dominant to the other modes of exchange that weren't. So if it was like T superscript B, it was T subscript A and T subscript C and any emergence of T subscript D. What I'm arguing is that that also includes domination over subscripts of the same kind. So capitalism dominates over all commodity exchanges. Kinship networks dominate over the gift exchange, particularly in terms of relationships, right? Relationships no longer are free. They become compulsive under kinship networks in a lot of cases. And then the monopoly on violence is precisely the domination of the lattice formation of T superscript B over the exchange functions T subscript B is my basic argument here. And I think that, in fact, what I'm basically making a converse argument you did, Gabriel, that the contract should be thought of precisely, and that's what Karatani is arguing here, that the contract comes out of the way that TB is transferred on to TA. And that is what the social contract comes out.
I agree that the nice, pretty social contract, which is a conscious, pretty agreement between two parties, I think that's a secondary thing. But like, I think Karatani also mentions that in Hobbes, he talks about commonwealth by agreement and commonwealth by fear, right? And that from the standpoint of the forming state, that doesn't matter.
No.
If I extract violently from you a commitment, or if you give me freely because of rational agreement, it doesn't matter. It's the same. So,
but it's also, he doesn't say they're indifferent. He doesn't say they're indifferent, though. He says that the agreement is a kind of extortion from fear. That's my point, is that the extortion from fear is what's primary.
Sure, but what's the problem with that?
The problem is the difference between a lattice formation and an exchange function. That contractual form is what happens when it becomes a full lattice form. But that is distinct from the exchange function.
That's fine. I'm okay with that.
That's what I'm saying. There's a difference between a contract and plunder and violent compulsion. That's my basic.
Logically, I don't see it.
Okay, I mean, like I admittedly don't understand the logic as much, so I'm going to keep going.
No. I mean, it's not no profound meaning of the word logic. Just in the sense that it seems to me that when we say, I mean, it might be totally wrong this way of thinking about it. I'm not sure, but like, if it makes sense to say that the state has to do with yes or no, right? If you want to say that the primitive form or the original form or the real form of the yes or no is a violent yes or no, right? It's a commitment extracted out of violent, through violent means. Or if once this is made into a consistent structure, that violence can be like a constant threat, but it's never enacted. And that's what we call a social agreement. I'm okay with that. I mean, what matters to me is the yes or no. I could change the name contract to some other name.
Yeah, no, and I agree. Like, I think it's a binary operation for sure.
Yeah, but that's, I mean, I don't know more. I'm not, personally, I'm not suggesting more than that.
Yeah. And for me, this is really gets when I'm trying to deal with questions of like history and stuff. So, I mean, in terms of the logic, binarity seems to be the main point, but I'm trying to come up with a question to account for kind of the history of states and the function of states today and stuff. And I think like, so this comes up to two different levels of the question. In other words, there are ways that a lattice obviously is connected to the other lattices, right? And so in one sense, you've got what Karatani just talks about, plunder, redistribution of wealth. And then he has this really interesting quote that basically like precisely money is what enables bureaucracies to really like hum, that there's something about the money perspective. But I think what's necessary, regardless of how you define T subscript B, is the same kind of construction you all have done with TC, where you start with the exchange function and you get to the lattice formation, and then everything else out of that, because it's
yeah, I totally agree. That should be possible. Like,
so that's the basic idea. And some of the historical reasons I went with this idea was to actually try to come up with a distinction between, like, to look in history where we have a lot more examples, right, of state formations falling apart. It's like we've had one real capitalist world economy and it hasn't truly fallen apart yet. It's just had lots of crises. But like we have seen entire empires collapse. You look at the 100 Years' War, you look at Machiavelli's analysis of the Condottiere, when you have a breakdown of the lattice formation, you have a reemergence of these organized acts of extraction, they do form on a level of the logic, there's a binary, but on the level of quantification, there's actually something taken, or in one form or another, life or your money, right? Like, but there's something there that I'm just kind of curious about. And then I basically had this, like, this is just speculation, playing around with Karatani's ideas. It doesn't really have anything to do with the logic, but the idea that the original kind of like forms of this would have actually been hunting, and that what we're really looking at is the beginning of human predation upon one another. And it had a lot of interesting ideological things, because if you look at like kinship networks and totems, you tend to see a relative horizontalism between the various totems, right? Like, you favor your totem, but there's no inherent supremacy. But with the state, you begin to get this like idea of like an actual difference into the substance. It's not just better or worse, it's an actual difference of substance between the divine and the rest of the people that are following it. To a certain extent, there seems to be a expansion of the difference between human and inhuman, and that like whatnot. So that's just an interesting idea in line with a lot of Karatani's interesting thoughts about the implications of this stuff. It's not a strong formal thing. But also, you mentioned the problem of centralization. I totally agree. Like, I think part of my problem with Karatani is the idea of centralization is inherent to the state. When you look at things like centralization and concentration in capitalism, that comes from within the dynamics of the commodity exchange. There's nothing about the state in that. You could even make an argument, I think, that at least factually speaking, I don't like, I'd want to look at the logic more, but if you just look at the move from band societies to sedentary kinship networks, those were relatively more centralized in some ways, even if not. So like, I think you can look at this as a much more generic structural issue that we can examine in terms of Badiou's logic and Bogdanov, and much less about like the particular exchange function. So I think that's a common point there. It also made me rethink things. So for example, like I said, I spent some time studying geopolitics. One of them was the Russo-Chechen War. And Chechnya, especially up until about 30 years ago, was very much like a kinship society, complete with blood vendettas and wife kidnapping. Very much, those were practices still going on up until the 80s in the mountains there.
And then they stopped.
Well, then a war happened and everything was forced to.
People were busy. I see. Okay.
Yeah, people got busy. And there's a whole story about jihadist Islam going in there and stuff. So a lot of things changed. But I think, like, for one thing, I think there's this common point here is I'm really skeptical of the romanticization, in part because of studying these. Like, there was nothing romantic about blood vendettas. There's nothing romantic about wife kidnapping. And the Karatani even has this point. He's like, well, exogamy and wife kidnapping still help make sure the women get shared around. I'm like, I don't think that's, I don't know.
Japanese,
like,
man.
There's a logic there, but I don't know. So I think but I think it's interesting to think about that, because again, these were kinship networks and not band societies. So the domination of T superscript A still would have had to have been in relationship to all of the exchange functions. And I've been playing around with the idea of like basically looking at blood vendettas and kidnapping as a form of this pillaging localized within kinship networks. So yes, it does function to maintain it. And I agree with Karatani and Kloster's on that point. But the idea that it's imminent to the gift exchange, I think is something I'm kind of like just playing around with. I don't know if I'm convinced one or the other, but I'm not convinced that the gift exchange inherently leads to these blood vendettas either. I'm not convinced by Karatani's argument. So this is just something I'm exploring otherwise. I just, I mean, you already basically brought up all the really juicy points about Karatani nationalism, Gabriel. I just basically brought up to remind that there's an important connection here with Reproduction, Federici Aruzza. And I think especially after what you said around like Black Panthers and stuff, this even has to do with like the state functionality and stuff. There's a lot there. And then finally, these are the kind of questions that like I actually really like to do myself. and I want to use this method on, right? So, so just to give an idea of what the kind of questions I hope to be able to answer with this stuff. One, Trump did a bunch of shit in the Middle East we know about, but in particular, there are a lot of alliances in the Gulf monarchies that shifted in relationship to Israel vis-a-vis Iran, right? And I think like Badu is really interesting to try to think through this, because like this is the kind of thing that in hindsight could be a real step towards a major military conflict or a war. It represents like a significant change, but contra Trump, it's not a real historic breakthrough either. It was a reconfiguration of alliances. It was a geopolitical maneuver. And in fact, in Baduvian terms, you can still very much see it in light of the actual events of the region, the Arab Spring. Like this is still a reconfiguration of alliances from the disaster for the powers that be of the Arab Spring. But I think like a lot of times we don't really have ways of specifying what these changes look like. When you see leftist, Marxist things, it's just a bad thing imperialism does. And of course it's a bad thing imperialism does, but I want to understand the implications, scales. That's one kind of thing. There are all these organizations I've been studying, and it actually was a lot of what I was studying before I got involved with you guys.
When you were doing serious stuff.
Yeah, well, the boring empirical stuff. Like there's a reason I get distracted with all the
serious stuff.
The boring, but Shanghai Cooperation Organization, Commonwealth of Independent States, these organizations that have emerged in the wake of the collapse of the Soviet Union and an attempt to maintain relations between China and Russia. And I won't go into it, but there's a ton of really interesting differences about how they structure these compared to the UN, the European Union. And again, it's a similar question. What are the differences? How do we quantify these differences? And especially when we look at, Five and some of Karatani's ideas about
man, you should present this case study. This stuff is amazing. I'd love to see the empirical boring stuff.
Yeah, I mean, like I want to. Like this is why I want to bring this to you guys.
I love how you're bringing this up. Like I have a small list here of issues I'm interested in.
Right. The last decade has been crazy for cyber attacks. Stuxnet is when the United States and Israel fucked up that collider centrifuge in Iran, first ever industrial control system hack. That was 2010. Mirai was the Internet of Things botnet attack to bring down an entire domain name server system. So entire quadrants of the internet were shut down. Ransomware shuts down cities, entire departments, corporations, and of course we've all heard about SolarWinds, I'm sure. Which happened a decade after Stuxnet. So I actually take a lot of perverse joy in that. The United States, after initiating this era of cyber warfare by attacking Iran, had the worst ever cyber attack, 10-year almost to the day.
I have no idea what that was like.
SolarWinds?
Yeah.
SolarWinds is a giant, it's now considered the largest hack in history.
It has something to do with Orion, whatever, right?
Well, basically, SolarWinds is a company that provides tons of IT infrastructure to everyone, the federal government, all the departments, tons of Fortune 500 companies, everything that's big had SolarWinds in it. And SolarWinds got hacked. A build server, so their actual source code construction got hacked, and update system got hacked, which meant all these things got Trojan system sent out through SolarWinds, and then highly advanced hacker teams use those to then go in, break into all these different companies and use a ton of different tactics, strategies, and they went for an unprecedented amount of time without being detected, and they don't even know if they've closed all the gates yet.
And what did these guys do with all this access?
Well, I mean, it's supposedly the Russian government, so it's the entirety of whatever states do with all the stuff that they spy on, right?
Yeah, because that's what they did the greatest hacking job of all time, and
mostly emails.
they read a bunch of emails.
Right,
I mean, I just hope somebody got very rich or some bomb was defused, because otherwise it's very.
I mean, a lot of very rich, powerful gringos are very embarrassed right now. So I mean, there is some Schadenfreude in that, I think. And then actually, to end on U.S. imperialism, the specific thing of the United States sanctions regime, it's something I keep coming back to, is it's a very peculiar tool It's a very powerful weapon. It's a very unilateral thing. There's no other country that can really leverage it like the United States. It kind of speaks to me of like something that's singular about our moment, but I don't really have a theory and a tool to understand it. And I think there's something really logistical too, because when the United States sanctions one of these countries, it's a fucking logistical nightmare. And I mean, like, I'm sure you're all far more aware of that.
Yeah.
You know, like I went to Turkey in the wake couple years after sanctions for only a few months there, and the whole country is still recovering from that. So what it would look like to organize against
ridiculously
that,
powerful.
You know, I don't know if how much like I think Karatani strikes me as idealistic about the UN, but there's also a kind of truth, like in the current situation, if the UN fell apart, that would definitely be worse than better, right? Like that's not the kind of catastrophic leftist, like, oh, collapse is automatically good. I don't that's one of those things. So I think there's a realpolitik to that. I think there are certain questions. So these are the kind of things I'm hoping by specifying this stuff are my interests. I'm really glad to hear that there is some like resonance with other things going on, because I hope that this was useful for others. And also, like, I'm planning to go back to grad school. This is a lot of what I'm hoping to get into, and this has been a really good opportunity for me to work on that. So I just really appreciate y'all listening to me go on about this for a couple hours. So that's more or less it. I didn't go over everything, but I think I went over all the juicy bits, and I think I rethought some things anyway on the spot.
There's a lot of stuff there, man. I mean, sorry, Dennis. Yeah, please.
Oh, I was gonna say, yeah, it's really wonderful. I mean, the concrete examples and kind of applications, it really kind of challenges the formalism a lot, I see. And one thing I wanted to point out is the thing you brought up about Karatani saying that to understand the state, you have to consider it vis-a-vis other states, right? Like the interaction between states is actually the Karatani's way of understanding TB. And I think that actually is a question for us, because our TB with the logic of contract seems like intra-state. We don't really have a place for state versus other state interactions, and you know whether that maybe that is
we do. I disagree because I mean if you were to make a very quick parallel here, I buy into John's argument that we shouldn't call this the contract function, because contract already is a loaded word that we don't need it. We could call it the commitment function or whatever, where commitments might be achieved through violent means, right? Your servitude can be a commitment. So, but I mean, we have some general function, right? And we can start talking about very small consistent spaces where, for example, as I said, I think the minimal one is both of us commit to John, so we don't need to commit to each other, right? So that would be a basic, I mean, that can happen for many reasons, right? But that pretty much establishes a situation where we're both bound to John, but not to each other, right? Or only bound to each other through John, right? That would be like, you need 3 evaluations to describe that, right? So you have a little triangle, and there will be a 0 value between the 2 of us, Dennis, and a 1 value between both of us and John, right? Something like that. But it's a small building block, and it's very fragile. So finding out which are the ways that this holds for a large tessellation, so to speak, right? And what happens with that network once you grow it. For example, if everyone is committed to John, right? You logically have him as a central node, like you derive centrality simply from the fact that someone is the perspective of all the commitments. So from the perspective of John, you see everyone, but from the perspective of everyone, you don't see everything else, right? So if I'm not committed to Dennis, but I'm committed to John, and Dennis is committed to John, you get to Dennis and to me through John, but not the other way around. You can build very complex structures, right? and you can use communities to not simply have commitments between people, but commitments between communities and things like this to build actually quite complex kind of city-state structures. And when you ask the question about how can a commitment between city-states be made, you will arrive at a point where there is no centralized third party that can make that commitment, right? So
yeah, that's what I was wondering.
Yeah, but that's we can get. I mean, that's just the natural consequence of this, right? Once you reach the state level, the only way to get the state itself committed to something else is by the sort of lateral displacement. You don't get to establish like a further kind of ultra state that everything is committed to. I mean, if you just limit that, you get the sort of modern sovereign theory where a monarch is a monarch not because God recognizes him, but because the other state recognizes him as a monarch, right?
Yeah, yeah.
I think that fits nicely. I think I don't think it's kind of out of the way for this same building block structure.
I agree. Yeah, we can still talk about commitments and try to generate because there are of course commitments between states as well. I'm just wondering if things like conflicts, changing alliances, and so on.
Yeah, but this is where I think that the thing I was talking about really helps, man, because if you take it seriously, this idea of that the consistent lineament, material lineament for state functions is the logistical domain. You give a concrete meaning to geopolitics, right? Ultimately, what supports the system of sovereign recognitions is not going to be given by a further abstract domain of recognition and commitments, but by the groundwork of where are the logistical systems, how are they organized, right? I think that's what defines who are enemies and not enemies and friends ultimately in geopolitics. It's not, let's say, some third party that defines for states how they relate, right? So I think that ultimately this totally fits what we're doing with the capitalist transcendental, because you have the exchange function, it's inconsistent and localized. When you introduce production, you're able to go beyond some consistent exchange space and tie them together. But you simultaneously go up to capital, which is able to see more than these localized spaces. And the more you go up towards capital, the more you require the groundwork to be properly structured, like the dynamic system of production and reproduction of capital that we're trying to formalize right now. Right, where the productive, like we're pretty much right now redescribing the totality of total social capital for this with the overhead structure, right? So it's like from the productive groundwork. So I think it's a similar thing with the state. You can start with the state function being very inconsistent, localized. It allows to explain simple commitments. Then when you introduce resource monopoly or resource flow, right, and some level of material support, which we could call a logistical organization of a territory, these things can become consistent, right? No wonder that the story of the state is connected to agriculture, invention of cities, right? Postal office, all sorts of kind of logistical tapestry, right, in the world, or resource extraction. So those are the networks that are materially grounding, like they're the ones that are capable of guaranteeing the largest consistency of state formations, not the political superstructure, right? Which is already, I think Calatan's point is very good in this point, like the way that the state appears to itself in terms of appearing to its citizens, is already a deformation based on the nation transcendental. Because the way that the state appears to each other is actually through this kind of logistical routes, right? How far can you go and maintain your power, and versus how much you can extract from that expensive limit, right? So I think that gives it a geopolitical feel, like in the very logic of it, that ultimately this sort of logical structure is grounded the same way that the value logic is grounded on productive relations. The state logic would be grounded on logistical relations, which are relations of, you know, militaristic information systems, transportation systems, but pretty much resource structure, right?
And something that I think also, in terms of kind of microeconomics and stuff, has a very different internal mechanism than a lot of the kind of businesses that would lend themselves to becoming cooperatives. In terms of practical stuff, I think that's also very different, is that when we're talking about, you know, even just classical factories or some of the stuff that was coming up in terms of kind of like easier areas, like low capital intensive industries that could be cooperativized and stuff, like you go to that and then you zoom to this almost entirely different scale of logistical operations that are so extended. Like, what would it mean to have a cooperative running a telecom in the same kind of way? I think that it brings up different kinds of decision making and organizational questions that fit differently because it comes from a different kind of exchange process.
Yeah, but I totally think that we could work with what you're saying. Like, I don't see any contradiction at all. I totally get the critique about the contract as a more on the rhetorical side than on the logical side. I think it fits, and I think that then it does. We could, I mean, the idea that a state recognizes a state, right, or that it takes a commitment to recognize, right? So we need to commit to John to establish that we don't have a commitment, or things like this kind of trinitary structure, right? I think we can arrive at it, like we can work with it. Yeah. The thing that I didn't really imagine, that I think today really clarified for me, is that there is a really positive outtake if the answer to the question, what is to state as kinship is to reciprocity and production is to value, I would say logistics, which is like a generalization of bureaucracy that is more objective than bureaucracy. Bureaucracy is still very kind of the tension of the subject, the subjective kind of, oh, I'm treating myself like a machine, instrumental reason, blah blah blah. I think that's not really the core of it, right? That's already, let's say, logistical systems kind of requiring compliance from people. That's what it makes it look like, oh, the terrible bureaucracy. But what's truly behind it, it's more the systematic approach than the bureaucratic.
Exactly.
Itself.
Exactly.
I find that absolutely convincing. And I think that
it's good to hear.
No, I'm definitely convinced. But I mean, how to go about it? How many things can we throw in that basket and say that this explains this and that? I'm unclear because of what I told you, that I think sometimes treating it as a smaller thing with less kind of postulates or principles is useful, because then you get to construct the consequences by the mixture with other things. And I think that your concrete examples of Middle East alliances, cyber attacks, things like this, they would be amazing. I mean, if you just choose one and present it, it would be like, I think, an amazing kind of opportunity for us to see how these mixtures really clarify things, right? Like this.
And that's the thing. Like, I wish I could convey more clearly just some of the three streams of thought I've had, because some of these questions about methodology I've been asking for 15 years, and I feel like things have been coming together in the last 6 months that I've been struggling with for most of my intellectual life, you know. And part of what I'm hoping is, like, you all keep bringing up, like, we don't know, it's a small insular group, kind of trying to figure out how much this actually works. Like, just for me, is one person on the left or whatever, like it's been helping me a ton. You know?
I can feel like there is a lot of, like, you, in my opinion, you covered today like 5 or 6 different kind of related but separate threads, you know, like
this is true.
Computation and imperialism. I can see that being like a lifelong project. Like, you know, concrete analysis of the place of logistics in contemporary warfare and, you know, policy and things like that. There's another thing. The pure logic of, you know, the state function. I think it's a whole separate thing. Like, I don't know. I can see that there are connections between these things, but I had an easier time following like some of the threads more than others, because obviously you're developing them with different levels of detail. But I can definitely see the further development here, man. Like no question about it. Like, I'd be definitely up for I don't know. We could kind of try to separate all these different threads into separate meetings, you know, and then we like
that would be really helpful.
I don't know, like let's take one meeting just to speculate on what would be the pure form of the B transcendental and see how far what can we construct with it, you know, if it really holds on, holds up, and then take another one to discuss organization and logistics. Like, I think that the text that you mentioned, like I looked into like some literature of this lean production structure. Like, it's some crazy, very interesting, but
super fascinating. Yeah.
Super fascinating stuff. Yeah. I mean, there's another thing I think we could like take a separate meeting for it. I think the Hegel stuff could know like what sort of theory of the state, more philosophically minded, how could we connect that with all of that we're doing? I think we could also have a separate meeting there. I mean, one of the things that also makes me want to talk about the state's transcendental as being classical is because I think it would explain why Badiou kind of slips in being an event with calling the power set of possibilities the state, because the state is also classical and ontology is classical. So it looks like the state is ontologically prior, but that's just taking two things that have the same logic to be the same thing. You know, like all the possible, it's true, the state will have the benefit that while the predicates of value are inhuman and infinite in a very weird kind of intuitionistic way, the predicates that the state works with, they're classical. You either have them or you don't. You either can put them in your ID or you can't. And that gives the state the feeling that it's legislating over ontology, because ontology is also classical. But and I think Badiou accepts the identity of the two things. And I think with Karatani, you can and with what you're doing, what we're thinking about, we can separate those things. And we can say, sure, between nation, state, and capital, state is the more classical one. That doesn't make it ontological in any sense. Just means its logic is classical, right? It's not that, it doesn't say that much. So that also convinced me that this is a good path to take. So I don't know. I think that there are many threads we could pull. I'm deeply interested in like discussing more a definition of logistics. You know, examples of what it means to see things logistically rather than you know procedurally in a more vague sense. I think we could definitely spend more time on that. I think it would be really helpful. The pure state function and pure transcendental of the state would be a good meeting. I think the case studies that we're talking about would be like fascinating to go over them. So I'm all for everything you're doing. I would just probably split it into smaller meetings.
Yeah. This was just the first one.
No, but that was great, man.
In part to get it all out, and in part, because also like I want to hear what y'all are interested in. Like, there's a lot of things that interest me. But I want to see what resonates with the group and all that.
No, there's a lot of stuff that I would be interested in further development, definitely.
Well, I didn't even get really a chance to dig into much of Dennis's stuff, but there was a whole thing about how that related to imperialism. So.
Well, I want that. I want Dennis and imperialism. That's definitely. Please call a meeting, Dennis and imperialism.
It had to do with this thing, and basically like the idea of the globality condition, like needing to traverse the whole thing, and the fact that, you know, when capitalism just filled up the planet, that's actually a condition, like that in a certain sense, like it reached an entire, like it hit its globality condition. And that a way to think about it was that something was appearing that hadn't been appeared. We talked about it a bit, like this needs to be formalized more, but I thought it was a really interesting way to rethink that point from Lenin about the world filling up and stuff from a more formalizable way of like something that he wasn't wrong that something changed. I mean, we all know something changed in 1870, but trying to actually put your finger on it, short of just listing tons of statistics, which they both do. But like, you know, so this
but
was.
I'm very interested in, I mean, I think that this is a complicated topic also because I think that there's a previous discussion to be had on the, let's say, the present state of imperialism in the world, which requires some debate that I'm not well versed in terms of, okay, what's the situation with, how do we describe the current state of, you know, the place of the states and things like this after all the sort of economic changes, the place of China or whatever. And so there is a complicated debate to be had there, but I think that this discussion and I think that a lot of politics hinges on this, right? A lot of socialist organizations require you to maintain the sort of imperialist continuity between post-war world and now. And some other positions are more skeptical of this continuity. So I'm for example, myself, I'm a bit skeptical of it. Like, I think that let's say, the state functor for today, the imperialist functor of organizing what a world empire would be today, would very much require a very heterogeneous way of gluing together things that are only partially related. Whereas imperialism, in its more classical, canonical sense, suggested that this was not the case, that you actually had a sort of, you know, expansion of one thing that would cover everything, right?
Yeah, and you had the homogenization thesis.
Yeah, I think that this homogenization thesis and what comes after it, from the standpoint of the state specifically and how it relates to logistics, and logistics almost substituting homogeneity, right? Like logistical branches go where no homogeneity is. And I think that's ultimately why logistics is so special a topic, which is, well, what is the name of a non-homogeneous terrain for the state? It's called an enemy terrain, right? So no wonder that it's military logistics that explains how you move commodities and people through a terrain that is heterogeneous and conflicted. So logistics would be as important, I mean, inversely, is important in inverse proportion to the homogeneity thesis. If you have homogeneity in the state structure, you get a social space that doesn't make logistics such strategically central, whereas the more the reign that the state reigns over is itself warlike, right? The more logistics becomes, let's say, the existing feature of the state, right? Everything else can be crumbling as long as this sort of connection lines of resources and plunderers and redistribution is in play. Which I think the state is a great example of that right now, right? Like legitimacy can go down as long as that structure is kind of in place. With the exception of taxes.
Almost self-referring, because the structure is also what helps to determine what should be kept in place.
Yeah, exactly.
So you get this, yeah, for sure.
But I think I can see a connection between contemporary state theory, or let's say post-imperialism, and, you know, sheaves. That actually is a crazy. I'm waiting for that title. You know, post-imperialist sheaves.
It really works. If you think about it, just using the formalism we have so far with commitments, we can think of gluing as like given my set of commitments and your set of commitments, what is the combination or the joining of those two things, right? It's not necessarily adding all the commitments together, because certain commitments would cancel each other out or be in conflict. So to go back to the whole geopolitical alliances example, yeah, it would be interesting to think, what is a sheaf of two countries' commitments? Like if after a war, two countries are now going to be allies, what kind of conditions have to happen in terms of their agreements mutually, you know? This
It's
kind
really
of
interesting the way you put that, is that's much closer to the way that these new international organizations I listed, the SCO and CIS and stuff, they work much more through like contingent overlapping sets of agreements between nations, and the organization itself just kind of keeps track of all these individual sets of agreements. But there's much less of an effort following the kind of League of Nations model for this homogenous set of rules and homogenous set of agreements. So in a way, yeah, what you just described, Dennis, is the trend in the Eurasian kind of institution space right now.
There you go, Dennis, just deduced the Eurasian, transcendental deduction of the Eurasian logic. I'm happy with that. I mean, I buy that.
Yeah, I'll take that.
That's a good conclusion to say, yeah.
But I don't know. I really think that there is I mean, we might find a better way to describe in logic of commitment. I don't know. Perhaps there's a better way to talk about it. But I don't know. It really seems like, especially, I mean, one thing that we didn't say, but I think that goes along with that, is that we can define property precisely as the combination of one's commitment to another and to oneself, right? If I'm as committed to you or to something as I am to myself, that thing is my property, right?
Which is actually almost exactly Hegel's definition at the beginning of philosophy of right.
Yeah, it's pretty much exactly that.
Yeah, so that's really good. I like that.
Yeah, we can also get into property right very easily with this discussion, I think. And I don't know. So I think that there is a sort of quite a nice development we can make, and it's by focusing, and I would do that, like focus on the post-imperialist sort of this kind of crazy crisis of imperialist sort of state of the world and how states need to organize in that situation, because this kind of clarifies. I mean, this is valid also for our work on value theory, because historically I don't think we would be so accepting of such an emptied out, desubstantialized logical approach if capitalism hadn't destroyed every substance during the 20th century. Like, if you could still think about the worker whose life is poured into the object and the object represents that life and time, you wouldn't be so interested in this sort of purely logical, emptied out consistency for value. I think the same goes for the state, like paying attention to the fact that the taxiture of state structures and agreements and geopolitics today really emptied out from the sort of Rousseau-like participation on, the representation of parts of the state on the state and blah, 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 sovereignty, like taking that out and looking at this kind of skeleton of, I think it really is the best kind of thing to have in the back of your mind of, how far it can get. This way you don't risk making too much of a substantial construction that looks like the state is this monolithic thing. The monolithic thing can be a case, like for a specific situation of the more skeleton-like structure, I guess.
No, in fact, one of the things I kind of I didn't go into, but that's been in the back of my head, is kind of like a radicalization of Lazarou's idea of the heterogeneity of the state, like really pushing back against the monolithic notion of like the state is really just a composite of parts to solve this problem. Like there's nothing about them all being together that makes them a state. It's much more what happens when you look at things in terms of the problems that are being solved. Again, like a logistical problem, and not like this state as totality, right? Which is really what we get from Hegel, is this idea of like, what makes the state is that it connects all the things as a state. And that's why it's really so overwhelming.
Yeah, I think that this is really the point. Let me just send you another text here.
So I'm actually, before I got into this project, I was working through applied categories, and I'm going to get back to that after this, the 7 sketches book that you all quoted. And then hopefully after that, I can be more involved in the actual formalization. Like, I feel like I don't grasp the math enough yet to really kind of.
Man, I really don't think I mean, we're having a easier time because Marx pretty much, I mean, if we didn't have Marx to constantly mimic, we would be totally lost, I think. So I wouldn't be too harsh on like finding the proper path.
Oh no, but I'm doing this because I want to. Like, this is the work I want to do.
But my point is simply like I would take time making sure that conceptually we can describe things in a very kind of condensed, minimal way before we try to
mathematize
too much of a because
I mean, really my goal right now is to try to understand what you all have done more than to try to do
I'm
this.
also having a hard time with that, so don't worry.
And actually, we were talking when I talked to Dennis last weekend. He asked me kind of like thoughts I had about getting the ideas out there and stuff. And one of the things I was thinking would be good was if me and other members that aren't the two of you kind of wrote précis or little summaries of parts of the project so far, to try to, because it'd be good to see what it looks like when we try to summarize. That's always good. And it'd be good for you all to be like, oh, we meant to say this, and then John said he thought we said that. Like that can be a really good feedback. And I was just wondering about like ways of trying to make it generic in the sense of like it's being talked about as a method of a group of people,
I totally agree that I think
I'm not sure what that looks like in practice, but
I think that whatever people want to do would be great, but I feel like since we haven't really managed to totally conclude, like we've been struggling the last couple of months with this last section, which I think is taking a bit longer, also because life is like acquiring more, it's getting faster and so on. I think once that's done, we could definitely try a new presentation that is more like a discussion and like summary, like to chew on the stuff rather than present it in this sort of linear way. Because I really think that there is like basic points of view that it kind of suggests and ways of approaching stuff that we didn't really spend enough time making sure that it makes sense to everyone, or at least testing it to everyone.
I see it. I see this primer document more like a blueprint or a reference manual, even. And it's definitely not the best way of presenting it.
Yeah, I agree.
And or even making it something that other people can use in their own work, right? I mean, I think it's something we should be referencing to see if things are consistent. So we can say like 3.2.5 is like inconsistent with 5.2.7. Like the statements don't make sense together. That's useful. But I think what you're doing with logistics and case studies, that's actually way more useful, and what we should be doing to like make it circulate with everyone in the group.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I think that this is something that we will probably be able to substitute the primer for more concrete texts also in the near future, because once it's kind of settled there, I think that one of the big tasks we'll have ahead of us is pretty much like taking small parts of it and kind of contextualizing, putting it into examples, seeing how it works and things like this. Like we haven't even developed a strategy on how to, like, what problems to tackle with this that are used directly. So
I thought y'all were going to start out small by solving the transformation problem.
Yeah, we're
just a little thing.
Just a little easy thing. Though I'm one thing that I mean, it's getting late. I need to go, but I just wanted to mention that Hegel and I were probably gonna put in the list a presentation in the next few weeks because we're doing a course. We're giving a course together here in Brazil on book 3, volume 3 of Capital, and especially the relation between Marx's theory of rent and the basic income. So, is basic income a form of rent? What's the relation between wages and basic income and things like this? So we're pretty much gonna try to use some of the stuff we've developed in a concrete problem, So there will also be a lot of case studies for us to discuss in that case, in that situation, I think. Honestly, I have the impression that the thing that is most useful in the primer, like, because just like it always comes up, is the multi-layer transcendental. Like, I really think that it's the part of it that is more immediately useful, simply because it gives you a language to talk about mixing things together without, like, it gives you a way to navigate this mess that is in itself. If we had just that, I think it's already something we can use more confidently. And then the second thing that I think is very useful but I think still requires some tweaking to make it more manipulatable is the underlying logic behind the way we approach the value form. This idea of components and predicates, because we can change the logic to classical, paraconsistent, or whatever, but that strategy for creating an object that sees more things than the objects that created it, it will appear in state logic, community logic, and
that was such a huge piece, I think, of really like what made this thing sing for me, was once I really started thinking about it in terms of objective phenomenological appearance.
Yeah, I think that's what really gives the objective phenomenology, like.
But also, I would never have done that. I mean, like, part of the difference is, like, I could never have gotten there just reading Badiou. I've been thinking about, like, reading Badiou now that I've got this framework, and also trying to imagine what it would have been like reading Karatani's book without that framework, because I feel like I got a lot more out of the book.
I don't know how we got to this, man. Like, I just know we read Badiou and discussed a lot of food stuff and restaurants, and suddenly we were talking about like what measures the flip. Yeah, I don't know, but I think that those are the two things that I really think we can make stick. The rest, I think it really requires a fine tuning and perhaps a bit more kind of banging our heads against the wall to find the right way to present it.
Yeah, I think the objective logic is how the primer dialogues with Badiou, the logic of commodity value form stuff. The multi-layer transcendentals obviously is our way, it's our bridge to Karatani. And then the last part, which is the operads, is our bridge to Bogdanov.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah. So it all comes together.
Everything in here hinges really on the operads part, because you don't get the value stream mapping.
Yeah, the value stream was really clearly with the operad. Yeah. But I could see, I mean, the point, it seems to me that if you were to develop the value stream more generally, so not only for companies concerned with optimizing profit, but for example, the stream structure for information systems or for other things, you would start going towards pure state or proper state issues and not beyond what we did with the operads, because we are only describing operads using them insofar as they turn commodities into more valuing commodities, right? But there is a fine grain there, which is kind of we'll never have the means to directly see, because they don't necessarily translate in terms of value components, priceable parts, right?
Yeah.
Which I think is where it would be a very interesting study of where logistics and value production are kind of deeply supporting one another, but not coinciding, right? Because
yeah.
you know where one day we could do this study with The Wire. That season 2 of The Wire is a perfect place to study everything we're working on. I think it's just like such a. I mean, I've never seen. I don't know. I'm just obsessed with The Wire. I cannot go there, but yes, it's all there.
That's okay. I mentioned. Have you ever seen True Detective? Matthew McConaughey? Yeah. I mentioned that as one of my examples. Is like the police is kind of like the ones like determining. There's a binary there that they explore throughout the show. You know, you're either in or out, you're bad or you're good. And
yeah. It's a good example.
But yeah, no, the Wire is also.
Yeah, I mean, I think I will do a presentation on The Wire at some point because I'm just so obsessed with it.
You should.
I think Karatani and the whole different modes, it works so well with like, you know, clearly Avon Barksdale is, you know, mode A, and Stringer Bell is mode B, you know, and I mean Omar is clearly mode D, so you can totally like, oh my god, don't even, yeah. I'll think about it.
What about what's his name? The last one.
Marlowe. I think he's pure mode C. I think he is
pure mode C. Okay.
I think so.
Okay. So,
I don't know. It's something to it's a very important topic to talk about. Anyway, guys, I need to run. But,
all right.
But John, this was amazing, man. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, John.
Thank you all for listening through to it. So,
See you, man.
Take care.
Take care, guys. Bye-bye.